He was a ghost of the New York underworld, a legend whispered about in the smoky backrooms of bars in Queens. He was a man who loved the art of the score more than the money it produced, a charming, generous, and utterly ruthless hijacker and killer who orchestrated the single largest cash robbery in American history at the time. And when the perfect crime began to unravel, he became a phantom of a different kind, a methodical specter of death who, one by one, eliminated almost every single person who had been a part of his crew, leaving a trail of bodies that stretched from the swamps of New Jersey to the upstate woods. His name was Jimmy Burke, the man they called Jimmy the Gent. Tonight, we journey into stories of the perfect crime and the flawed, all-too-human people who attempt them. These are tales of audacious plans, of immense fortunes hanging in the balance, and of the single loose thread, a moment of greed, a careless word, a flash of paranoia that can cause the entire elaborate tapestry of a brilliant crime to unravel into a bloody mess. It is the quiet, electric hum of a plan coming together, the deafening silence inside a vault, and the cold, creeping dread that comes when the partners in a perfect crime begin to realize that the most dangerous enemy is not the law, but each other. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a humbling experience to see how far these stories travel, and how many of us are gathered here in this shared, quiet space. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Lufthansa heist. The John F. Kennedy International Airport in the New York City of the 1970s was a world unto itself. It was a sprawling, chaotic, and almost lawless frontier. A city within a city with its own culture, its own hierarchies, and its own deeply ingrained systems of corruption. For the powerful organized crime families of New York, particularly the Lucchese family, which controlled the airport's unions and its cargo operations, JFK was more than just a travel hub. It was a private bank, a vast, cash-rich territory to be plundered at will. From hijacking cargo trucks filled with French wine and Italian silks to pilfering valuables from passengers' luggage, the airport was a criminal's paradise, a place where a man with the right connections could make a fortune. And in this world, no one had more connections, more power, or more ambition than a man named Jimmy the Gent Burke. Burke was not an Italian and therefore could never be a made man in the mafia, but he was a highly respected and deeply feared associate of the Lucchese family, a man who ran his own, brutally efficient crew out of a dimly lit bar called Robert's Lounge in the working-class neighborhood of South Ozone Park, Queens. He was a handsome, charismatic Irishman, known for his impeccable style, his generosity. He was famous for tipping $100 bills and his almost pathological love of hijacking. But beneath the charming, smiling exterior was a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless killer, a man who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. For years, Burke and his crew, which included his protege, a young, ambitious mobster named Henry Hill, had treated JFK as their personal piggy bank, pulling off a series of successful, if relatively small-time, heists. But in the autumn of 1978, a piece of information fell into their laps that would transform their small-time pilfering into the score of a lifetime. The source of the information was an insider, a man on the other side of the fence. His name was Louis Werner, a cargo agent for the German airline Lufthansa. Werner was a man with a problem, a massive and growing gambling debt. His bookmaker was a man named Martin Krugman, a flamboyant and deeply neurotic character who ran his business out of a wig shop in Queens. Werner, desperate to pay off his debts, offered Krugman a tip, a piece of information so valuable it was like being handed a map to a dragon's hoard. Werner explained that every month, Lufthansa flew in a massive, untraceable shipment of American currency from its exchange operations in West Germany. The cash, often amounting to several $1 million, was stored for a short time in the airline's high-value cargo vault at JFK before being picked up by an armored car. Werner knew the security protocols, the layout of the vault, the names of the guards, and the exact timing of the shipments. He was offering the key to the kingdom. Krugman, who was a close associate of Henry Hill, immediately saw the potential. This was not a score. This was the score. He brought the information to Hill, who in turn brought it to the only man in Queens who had the vision, the resources, and the sheer audacity to pull off a crime of this magnitude. Jimmy Burke. For Jimmy the Gent, the Lufthansa tip was the culmination of a life's work. This was the one big one. The score that would set them all up for life. The heist that would make them legends in the underworld. He became consumed by the plan, his mind, which was a brilliant instrument for criminal logistics, working overtime. The plan, as it took shape in the back room of Robert's lounge, was a model of brutal simplicity. It was not a complex, high-tech operation. It was a smash and grab, a robbery that relied not on sophisticated gadgetry, but on speed, surprise, and the invaluable intelligence provided by their inside man. Werner gave them everything they needed. He told them that the vault was protected by a series of simple locks and a single, often distracted, night shift security guard. He gave them the names of the handful of cargo agents who would be on duty on the night of the shipment. He told them that the key to the whole operation was a specific, interlocking series of doors that had to be opened in the correct sequence to access the vault itself. He drew them maps. He gave them schedules. He was the architect of his own company's downfall. Burke began to assemble his crew. He knew that for a score this big, he needed professionals. Men who were reliable, who could handle pressure, and most importantly, who knew how to keep their mouths shut. He did not choose the hot-headed, flashy members of his own crew, men like the dangerously volatile Tommy DeSimone. Instead, he handpicked a team of seasoned, outside professionals, a group of expert thieves and gunmen from another Lucchese family crew. The leader of the handpicked team was a man named Pernell Stacks Edwards, who was to be the driver of the getaway vehicle. The plan was set for the night of the next major currency shipment. The crew, a team of about 6 men, would use a black Ford Econoline van. They would cut the lock on a perimeter fence to gain access to the cargo area, avoiding the main security gates. They would then drive directly to the Lufthansa cargo building, Building 261, a massive, anonymous warehouse on the far side of the airport. They would storm the building in the dead of night around 3 a.m., when the skeleton night crew would be at its most vulnerable. They would round up the handful of employees, using the element of surprise and overwhelming force to prevent any alarms from being triggered. They would then use the information provided by Werner to force the employees to open the vault. They would load the cash and valuables into the van, take one of the employees as a temporary hostage to ensure a clean getaway, and then drive to a safe house, an auto body shop in Brooklyn, where the money would be transferred to a switch car and the evidence, the van, would be immediately destroyed. It was a perfect, almost foolproof plan. It was audacious, it was simple, and it was built on the most powerful weapon in any criminal's arsenal: perfect inside information. As the date of the heist, December 11th, 1978, approached, a quiet, electric anticipation settled over the crew at Robert's lounge. They were on the verge of pulling off the biggest cash robbery in the history of the United States. They were about to become kings. But their perfect plan had a single fatal flaw, a flaw that was woven into the very fabric of the criminal world they inhabited: the flawed, greedy, and ultimately treacherous nature of the men themselves. The seeds of the bloody, paranoid unraveling that was to come were already being sown, long before the first dollar was ever stolen. In the deep, cold, pre-dawn hours of December 11th, 1978, the plan that had been so meticulously crafted in the back rooms of Robert's lounge was set into motion. A black Ford Econoline van, stolen for the occasion, moved silently through the deserted service roads of JFK Airport, its headlights off. Inside were 6 heavily armed men, their faces obscured by ski masks, their bodies humming with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. They were a hand-picked crew of professionals, led by a man named Jimmy the Gent Burke. Although he was not physically present for the raid itself, he was the conductor, waiting for the symphony of the score to play out. At precisely 3 a.m., the van pulled up to the loading ramp of the Lufthansa cargo building, Building 261. The men poured out a swift, disciplined unit. They stormed the building, their shotguns and pistols held at the ready. The half-dozen Lufthansa employees on the night shift were caught completely by surprise. The robbers were a whirlwind of controlled, professional violence. They rounded up the workers, shouting orders, their voices muffled by their masks. "On the floor! Don't look at us! they yelled. The workers, terrified, complied instantly. There was no resistance. The leader of the robbery crew, a man who remained unidentified, had the detailed inside information provided by Lewis Werner. He knew the name of the one supervisor who had the key to the main vault. He separated him from the others and, with a gun to his head, forced him to lead them to the high-value storage area. The supervisor was forced to deactivate the alarms and to open the series of interlocking doors. Finally, they reached the main vault. The robbers were not prepared for what they saw. They had been expecting a few bags of cash. What they found was a mountain of it. The vault was stacked with bags and cartons of untraceable American currency. The shipment that had arrived that night was far larger than anyone had anticipated. The crew worked with a frantic, almost gleeful efficiency. They formed a human chain, passing the heavy bags and boxes of cash from the vault to the waiting van. They also scooped up a tray of jewels, an unexpected bonus. In just a matter of minutes, they had loaded the van with a staggering amount of loot. They had come for a score. They had stumbled upon a king's ransom. They herded the terrified Lufthansa employees into a lunchroom, warning them not to move or call the police for at least 15 minutes. They had the names and addresses of their families, a chilling implied threat that guaranteed their silence. They then drove away from the building, melting back into the anonymous labyrinth of the airport's service roads. The entire operation had taken just 64 minutes. It was a flawless, perfectly executed robbery. The crew drove to the prearranged safe house, an auto body shop in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn. There, they met with Jimmy Burke. The mood was one of pure, unadulterated elation. They had done it. They had pulled off the perfect crime. They transferred the bags of cash, which were far too numerous to count at that moment, into a switch car. The plan was for Pernell Stax Edwards, the one member of Burke's own crew who had been chosen for the heist, to take the van to a car compactor in New Jersey, where the single most important piece of evidence would be immediately crushed into an unrecognizable cube of metal. The initial estimates of the haul were around $2 million. But as Burke and his inner circle began the long, clandestine process of counting the money, they realized it was far, far more. The final official tally was $5 million in cash and nearly $1 million in jewels, the equivalent of over $24 million today. It was the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States. Jimmy Burke and his crew were not just rich. They were legends. But the perfect crime, the one that had been so flawlessly executed, began to unravel almost immediately, undone not by the brilliance of the police, but by the stupid, greedy, and fatally undisciplined actions of the criminals themselves. The first and most catastrophic mistake was made by the driver, Stax Edwards. Instead of driving the van directly to the junkyard in New Jersey, as he had been explicitly and repeatedly instructed to do, he decided to make a detour. Edwards, a heavy cocaine user, decided he wanted to get high. He drove the van to his girlfriend's apartment in a housing project, parked it in a no-parking zone directly in front of a fire hydrant, and went inside to celebrate. He would get rid of the van later, he figured. 2 days later, the police, who were canvassing the city for any sign of the black Ford van, found it. It was sitting exactly where Edwards had left it, a glaring, obvious piece of evidence in the middle of a public street. Inside the van, they found a muddy boot print and the fingerprints of several of the men who had been involved in the heist. The police now had their first crucial physical link to the robbers. For Jimmy Burke, this was more than just a mistake. It was an unforgivable act of betrayal, a violation of the sacred, professional code of their world. Stax Edwards had been given one simple, critical job, and his selfish, unprofessional indulgence had now put the entire multi-million-dollar score and the lives of everyone involved in jeopardy. Burke was a man who did not tolerate loose ends, and in his cold, paranoid, and increasingly ruthless mind, Stax Edwards had just become a very dangerous loose end. The second crack in the wall of silence came from the very top. The sheer, spectacular scale of the robbery had attracted the attention of the FBI and the highest levels of the organized crime world. The Lucchese family, which considered JFK to be their exclusive territory, was not pleased that Burke had used an outside crew for such a massive score on their turf. They wanted a piece of the action, a tribute payment for the privilege of having pulled off the heist in their backyard. This created a new and immense pressure on Jimmy Burke. He now had to pay off the police, he had to pay off the mob bosses, and he had to divide the rest of the loot among the members of his crew, all while the FBI was beginning to breathe down their necks. The elation of the perfect score was quickly being replaced by the paranoia of the aftermath. And then, the members of the crew themselves began to get greedy and careless. They had been explicitly warned by Burke to lay low, to not make any flashy purchases, to act as if nothing had happened. But the lure of the newfound, untraceable cash was too much for some of them to resist. One of the robbers, a man named Louis Caffra, bought his wife a brand new, pink Cadillac Fleetwood, a car that was so ostentatious it was practically a rolling confession. Another, Teresa Ferrara, a beautiful woman who had acted as a courier for the crew, was known to have a cocaine problem and a tendency to talk too much. For Jimmy Burke, the man who was now the custodian of a secret that was worth millions, every one of these indiscretions, every one of these loose lips, was a direct threat to his own life and liberty. He began to see his own crew not as partners, but as liabilities. The perfect crime was starting to come apart at the seams, and Jimmy the Gent, a man known for his charm, was about to be replaced by Jimmy the Butcher, a man who would go to any length and kill any number of his own friends, to protect his score and to ensure that the only person who could connect him to the Lufthansa heist was a ghost. The discovery of the abandoned Ford Econoline van was the moment the euphoria of the Lufthansa heist curdled into a cold, creeping paranoia for Jimmy Burke. The perfect, traceless crime now had a physical artifact, a piece of evidence that was contaminated with the fingerprints and the boot prints of the men he had entrusted with the score. In the ruthless, high-stakes calculus of the underworld, this was more than just a piece of bad luck. It was an existential threat. And Jimmy Burke was a man who dealt with threats in a singular and final way. He began to systematically eliminate every single person who could connect him to the robbery. The perfect crime was about to be protected by a perfect, bloody purge. The first to go was Pernell Stax Edwards, the careless driver who had failed to dispose of the van. Just 6 days after the heist, on December 18, 1978, Burke sent two of his most trusted and psychopathic enforcers, Tommy DeSimone and another man, to pay Edwards a visit. They found him in his apartment, in the middle of a cocaine-fueled celebration. There was no argument, no confrontation. They simply shot him 6 times in the head and chest with a silenced pistol. Stax Edwards, the first loose end, had been tied up. His death was a cold, clear message to everyone else involved. The celebration was over, and the era of paranoia had begun. The purge continued with a grim, methodical efficiency over the next 6 months. Burke, now a man consumed by a murderous obsession with secrecy, began to see ghosts and informants everywhere. Anyone who had been involved in the heist, anyone who knew about the heist, anyone who had even heard a whisper about the heist, was now a potential witness, a liability that had to be eliminated. Louis Caffra, the flashy robber who had bought his wife the pink Cadillac, disappeared in March of 1979, along with his wife, just a few months after the heist. Their bodies were never found. The police believe they were murdered and their bodies disposed of in one of the mob's secret graveyards. Their pink Cadillac a final, garish tombstone for a fatal act of indiscretion. Teresa Ferrara, the beautiful courier with the cocaine habit and the talkative nature, also vanished. Her dismembered torso, missing its head and hands, was found floating in a swamp in New Jersey a few months later. Martin Krugman, the neurotic bookmaker who had been the original source of the tip, the man who had brought the score to Henry Hill, also disappeared. He had become increasingly agitated and demanding in the aftermath of the heist, constantly pestering Burke for his share of the money. He was last seen in January of 1979. His body was never found. Henry Hill would later claim that Burke and DeSimone had killed him, dismembered his body, and buried the pieces in the basement of Robert's Lounge itself. One by one, the men who had been a part of the triumphant, jubilant crew on the night of the robbery were being erased from the face of the earth. The heist, which was supposed to have been their ticket to a life of ease, had become their death sentence. The only man who was safe was the one who was doing the killing, Jimmy Burke. And then there was the inside man, the Lufthansa employee Louis Werner, the man whose gambling debts had set the entire bloody saga in motion. Werner, who had provided the crucial intelligence, was one of the few who had been arrested and convicted for his role in the robbery. He had been identified by his coworkers and had confessed to his part in the plan, though he claimed he did not know the names of the robbers themselves. He was sentenced to prison, a fact that, ironically, probably saved his life. Behind bars, he was out of Jimmy Burke's murderous reach. The only other key player who was still alive and on the outside was the man who had been at the very center of the crew, Jimmy Burke's own protege, Henry Hill. And Hill was beginning to realize that he was living on borrowed time. Henry Hill was a man who had lived his entire adult life in the shadow of the mob. He was a cunning, charismatic, and deeply ambitious criminal. A man who loved the life, the respect, the easy money, and the thrill of it all. But he was not a killer like Burke or a psychopath like Tommy DeSimone. And as he watched his friends and partners disappear one by one, he knew with a sickening certainty that he was likely next on Jimmy's list. His own life began to spiral out of control. He was arrested on a separate, unrelated narcotics trafficking charge and was facing a long prison sentence. He was also deeply addicted to cocaine, a habit that was making him increasingly paranoid and unreliable. He knew that Jimmy Burke, a man who despised drug users and saw them as inherently untrustworthy, would see his addiction as another dangerous liability. The bond of trust and loyalty that had once existed between the master and his apprentice had been completely corroded by the paranoia of the Lufthansa score. The final, terrifying signal for Henry Hill came with the disappearance of Tommy DeSimone. Tommy, a man who had been one of the most feared and violent members of Burke's crew, a man who had been one of the primary executioners in the post-heist purge, had his own past to answer for. Years earlier, he had murdered a made man from the powerful Gambino crime family, an unforgivable sin in the world of the mafia. In January of 1979, the Gambinos finally caught up with him. He was lured to a meeting, and he was never seen again. His death, while not directly ordered by Burke, was another piece of the puzzle falling away. Another voice that could have testified against him, permanently silenced. With Tommy gone, Henry Hill knew he was exposed. He was one of the last living links to the Lufthansa heist. He knew that Jimmy Burke was planning to kill him. He could feel the net closing in around him. He was facing a long stretch in federal prison for his drug conviction, and he knew that if he went to jail, Burke would find a way to have him killed inside. He was trapped. And so, in 1980, Henry Hill, the lifelong mobster, the man who had lived his entire life by the code of silence, omerta, made a decision that was, in his world, the ultimate act of betrayal. He decided to break the code. He decided to save his own life by becoming a government witness. He became an informant, a rat. He walked into the U.S. Attorney's office and began to tell them everything he knew. He told them the story of his life in the mob, and he told them the entire, secret and bloody story of the Lufthansa heist and of the murderous purge that had followed it. He gave them the one man they had never been able to touch, Jimmy the Gent Burke. The decision by Henry Hill to become a cooperating witness for the federal government was the final, fatal turning point in the Lufthansa saga. For the FBI, who had been struggling for years to build a case around the robbery, Hill's testimony was a goldmine, an unprecedented, insider's account of the inner workings of one of the most successful and murderous criminal crews in New York. Hill was not just a witness. He was a tour guide into the secret, violent world of Jimmy Burke. Based on Hill's detailed and extensive testimony, the government was finally able to do what years of investigation had failed to do. They were able to indict Jimmy, the Gent Burke, but the indictment was not for the Lufthansa heist itself. Hill's testimony, while powerful, was still the uncorroborated word of a career criminal. Instead, the prosecutors used Hill's information to build a case against Burke for a different crime, a point-shaving scandal involving the Boston College basketball team, a scheme that Burke had masterminded. In 1982, Jimmy Burke was convicted on conspiracy charges related to the basketball scandal and was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. It was not the Lufthansa case, but it was enough. The man who had once been the untouchable king of the Queen's underworld was now behind bars. And while in prison, based on further detailed testimony from Henry Hill about another, unrelated murder, Jimmy Burke was finally convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He would never be a free man again. He died in prison from lung cancer in 1996, at the age of 64, having never been officially convicted for his role as the mastermind of the largest cash robbery in American history. The legal case of the Lufthansa heist itself ended with a frustrating, almost absurd whimper. Only one person, the inside man, Louis Werner, ever served significant time for the robbery. All of the men who had physically carried out the heist, save for one who had driven a crash car, were dead, murdered by the very man who had organized it. And the mastermind himself was in jail for other crimes. The case file on the Lufthansa robbery remains, in a technical sense, largely unsolved. And the money, the nearly $6 million in untraceable cash, was never recovered. It is believed to have been squandered by Burke, paid off to mob bosses, and spent by the crew members in their brief, fatal burst of extravagance. The greatest cash robbery in history had left a trail of at least 10 bodies, but almost none of the cash. The legacy of the Lufthansa heist is a powerful and enduring one, a story that has been transformed from a classic, real-life crime into a cornerstone of American pop culture mythology. This transformation was due almost entirely to the work of a single writer, the acclaimed journalist Nicholas Pileggi. In 1986, Pileggi published a book called Wise Guy, Life in a Mafia Family, which was based on extensive, detailed interviews with Henry Hill, who was now living a new, anonymous life in the Federal Witness Protection Program. The book was a stunning, granular, and deeply authentic portrait of the day-to-day reality of mob life. And at its heart was the dramatic and bloody story of the Lufthansa heist and its paranoid, murderous aftermath. The book was a massive success, and it caught the eye of the acclaimed film director Martin Scorsese. In 1990, Scorsese adapted Pileggi's book into the film Goodfellas. The film was an instant classic, a masterpiece of modern American cinema that is widely regarded as one of the greatest gangster films ever made. The film brought the story of Jimmy the Gent Burke, renamed Jimmy Conway, and played with a chilling, charismatic menace by Robert De Niro, Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta, and the psychopathic Tommy DeSimone, renamed Tommy DeVito, in an iconic, Academy Award-winning performance by Joe Pesci. To a global audience, the film's brilliant, stylish, and often brutally violent depiction of the Lufthansa heist and its aftermath immortalized the story, turning a cast of real-life, sordid, and often pathetic criminals into legendary, almost mythic, figures. The legacy of the Lufthansa heist, therefore, is a story about the strange and powerful alchemy that can transform a true crime into a work of art. For the world, the story is no longer about the real Jimmy Burke or the real Henry Hill. It is about the characters portrayed by Robert De Niro and Ray Liotta. The gritty, often banal, reality of their lives has been replaced by the romantic, seductive, and ultimately tragic glamour of the film. But the real story, the one that lies beneath the brilliant cinematic surface, is a far darker and more cautionary tale. It is a story about the corrosive and ultimately self-destructive nature of greed. It is a story of a perfect crime that was undone, not by the police, but by the inherent fatal flaws of the criminals themselves, their egos, their carelessness, and their profound, almost bottomless capacity for betrayal. And it is a story about the ultimate futility of a life built on violence and theft. The men who pulled off the score of a lifetime, the one that was supposed to set them all up as kings, ended up with nothing. They were either dead, in prison, or, in the case of Henry Hill, living a life of quiet, paranoid anonymity, forever looking over his shoulder, a ghost in his own suburban life, forever haunted by the memory of the life he had betrayed. The money was gone, the crew was gone, and all that was left was the story. A story that serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that, in the world of the mob, the only real currency is violence, and the only final, inevitable payoff is death. The Munich Massacre, the summer of 1972 in Munich, West Germany, was meant to be a festival of light, a deliberate and powerful act of historical exorcism. The city was hosting the XXTH Olympiad, and the West German government had poured immense resources and a profound sense of national hope into creating what they called Die Heiteren Spiel, or the Games of Peace and Joy. This was to be the antithesis of the last Olympics held on German soil, the infamous 1936 Berlin Games, which had been a chilling, swastika-draped spectacle of Nazi propaganda. The 1972 Munich Games would be different. They would be open, optimistic, and informal. The architecture of the newly built Olympic Village was a testament to this vision, a collection of pastel-colored, Mediterranean-style apartment buildings nestled in a lush, green landscape of parks and artificial lakes. The security was deliberately, almost naively, light. The unarmed guards in their light blue uniforms were called Olis, and their primary job was to offer directions and a friendly smile. The entire atmosphere was designed to be a fragile bubble of international goodwill, a testament to a new, democratic Germany that had risen from the ashes of its own dark history. For the 11,000 athletes from around the world who had gathered in this carefully constructed utopia, it was a time of intense competition and easy camaraderie. In the first week of September, the Games were in full swing, and the Olympic Village was a vibrant, bustling community. On the evening of September 4th, for the Israeli Olympic team, it was a night of quiet relaxation. Some of their athletes had already finished their competitions. They were a small, close-knit delegation of coaches, athletes, and officials. That evening, a group of them went out to see a performance of Fiddler on the Roof in the city, a celebration of their shared culture in a land that had, just a generation before, sought to annihilate it. After the show, they returned to their apartments at 31 Kanalstrasse, a street in the village named after an Irish-American Olympic champion. They were tired, they were content, and they were safe. But a different kind of history was waiting in the shadows. Miles away, a group of 8 men were making their final preparations. They were members of a radical, militant Palestinian organization, a splinter group of the Palestine Liberation Organization that called itself Black September. They were not in Munich to compete or to celebrate. They were on a mission. Their goal was a brutal act of political theater, an attack designed to shatter the illusion of peace and to force the world to pay attention to their cause. Their plan was to take the Israeli athletes hostage and to demand the release of over 200 Palestinian militants who were being held in Israeli prisons. In the deep, pre-dawn hours of September 5th at approximately 4:30 a.m., the 8 commandos, dressed in athletic tracksuits and carrying bags filled not with sporting equipment, but with automatic rifles, pistols, and grenades, approached the perimeter of the Olympic Village. They came to a 6.5-foot-high chain-link fence. In a moment of profound and tragic irony, they were helped over the fence by a group of American athletes who were sneaking back into the village after a night out on the town. The athletes, seeing the men in their tracksuits, simply assumed they were fellow competitors and gave them a friendly, helping hand. The Black September terrorists had just breached the first and only line of security. Once inside the village, they moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They had stolen keys to help them navigate the buildings. They made their way directly to 31 Kanalstrasse. They knew exactly where the Israeli delegation was housed. The mission had been planned with the help of inside information, likely from a worker in the Olympic Village. They first entered apartment 1, which housed the coaches and officials. The first person they encountered was Josef Gutfreund, a 40-year-old wrestling referee. Gutfreund, a large, powerful man, heard a faint scratching at the door and went to investigate. As the door opened and he saw the masked, armed men, he threw his entire 300-pound body against it, trying to hold them back, screaming to his sleeping roommates to escape. His heroic, desperate act of resistance bought a few precious seconds. One of his roommates, a weightlifting coach named Tuvia Sokolsky, was able to smash a window and flee, but the terrorists were too many and too strong. They forced their way in, overwhelming Gutfreund. They rounded up the inhabitants of the apartment. Then they found another coach, 33-year-old Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach. Weinberg, a man of immense physical strength and courage, also fought back. He was shot in the cheek, the bullet passing through and lodging in the wall. Wounded and bleeding, he was now a captive. The terrorists, now with a group of hostages, knew there were more Israelis in the building. They forced the wounded Moshe Weinberg at gunpoint to lead them to the other apartments. In a final, desperate act of defiance and a clever attempt to save some of his teammates, Weinberg lied. He led them past apartment 2, which housed the Israeli marksmen and track and field athletes. who he likely believed would be better equipped to fight back. Instead, he led them to Apartment 3, which housed the Israeli weightlifters and wrestlers. As they entered Apartment 3, the Israelis were jolted from their sleep. In the chaos, one of the athletes, a fencer named Gad Sabari, managed to escape, dashing down a flight of stairs to the underground garage, but the others were trapped. And once again, they fought back. Yosef Romano, a 32-year-old champion weightlifter who had come to the Olympics on crutches after a knee injury, attacked one of the terrorists, slashing his face with a paring knife and managing to grab his AK-47 before he was shot and killed. The gunfire had now shattered the pre-dawn quiet of the Olympic Village. The terrorists, their mission partially compromised, quickly consolidated their position. They now had 9 living hostages. 2 Israelis, Moshe Weinberg and Yosef Romano, lay dead or dying. A note was thrown from the balcony of the apartment. It demanded the release of 236 Palestinian militants. The deadline was 9 a.m. If their demands were not met, they would begin executing the hostages. The games of peace and joy were over. A brutal intrusion of history had just taken the world stage. And as the sun rose over Munich, it illuminated a scene that would be broadcast live to a horrified global audience. The surreal, terrifying image of a hooded terrorist, a faceless specter of death, standing on the balcony of an Olympic apartment. The peaceful, 5-ringed symbol of the games, now the backdrop for a deadly, high-stakes hostage crisis. The news of the hostage crisis at 31 Kanalstrasse spread through the Olympic Village and then to the world with the speed of a lit fuse. The carefully constructed bubble of peace and goodwill had been violently burst. The West German authorities, who had prided themselves on the open, friendly atmosphere of the games, were now faced with a situation for which they were catastrophically unprepared. Germany, a nation still deeply scarred by its own history of state-sponsored violence, did not have a professional, trained anti-terrorism or hostage rescue unit. The task of managing the crisis fell to the Munich police and a hastily assembled team of government officials, men who were completely out of their depth, operating in the full, unforgiving glare of the world's media. The day of September 5th devolved into a long, agonizing, and deeply surreal standoff. The terrorists, now known to be members of Black September, repeated their demands. The Israeli government under Prime Minister Golda Meir was immediately contacted, and their response was swift and absolute. They would not negotiate with terrorists. Israel's long-standing policy was never to give in to such demands, a policy they believed was the only effective deterrent. The fate of the 9 Israeli hostages was now in the hands of the German negotiators. The German team, led by the Munich police chief, Manfred Schreiber, and the Bavarian Interior Minister, Bruno Merk, began a desperate and often clumsy attempt to buy time. They offered the terrorists an unlimited amount of money. They offered to trade the Israeli hostages for high-ranking German officials. The terrorists rejected every offer. They did not want money. They wanted their prisoners released. Theirs was a political act, not a criminal one, and they were playing for a global audience. As the negotiations stalled, the situation inside the apartment was grim. The 9 hostages, wrestlers, weightlifters, coaches, and officials, were bound together, their every move watched by the heavily armed terrorists. The body of the weightlifter, Yosef Romano, who had been killed in the initial struggle, was left in the room with them, a constant, gruesome reminder of their captor's capacity for violence. The entire tense drama was being broadcast live around the world. Television cameras were positioned on the roofs of the surrounding buildings. Their long lenses focused on the balcony of Apartment 1, where the hooded figure of the terrorist leader, a man who would later be identified as Isa, would periodically appear. This unprecedented, real-time media coverage had a devastating effect on the crisis. The terrorists were able to watch the police movements on television sets inside the apartment, giving them a tactical advantage and making any element of surprise for a potential rescue operation almost impossible. In the late afternoon, the German authorities made their first and most disastrous attempt at a rescue. A team of German police officers, dressed in athletic tracksuits and armed with submachine guns, were sent to crawl across the rooftops and rappel down the side of the building, with the intention of storming the apartment through the air vents. But the entire clumsy operation was being filmed by the television cameras and was being broadcast live. The terrorists, watching the news, saw the police preparing to attack them. One of them appeared on the balcony and angrily waved the police away, threatening to kill the hostages immediately if the assault was not called off. The rescue attempt, which had been compromised before it had even begun, was humiliatingly aborted. As the evening wore on and the situation reached a stalemate, the terrorists made a new demand. They wanted a plane to fly them and their hostages to Cairo, Egypt. This was a critical moment. The German negotiators, desperate to get the crisis out of the Olympic Village and away from the glare of the world's media, agreed. They saw it as an opportunity to move the confrontation to a more controlled environment, a remote airfield where a second, more effective rescue attempt could be staged. They had no real intention of letting the plane leave for Cairo. The plan was set. 2 helicopters would land in the Olympic Village to transport the terrorists and their 9 bound hostages to the nearby Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, a NATO airfield just outside of Munich. At the air base, a Boeing 727 passenger jet would be waiting on the tarmac, ostensibly to fly them to Cairo. The German authorities planned to use the transfer at the airfield as their moment to strike. It would be a sniper operation. They would pick off the terrorists as they moved from the helicopters to the plane and then rescue the hostages. The plan, on paper, was a desperate, high-risk gamble, but its execution would be a study in almost unbelievable incompetence. The Germans had no trained snipers. The men they chose for the job were regular police officers who were considered to be good marksmen. They were given standard-issue Heckler and Koch G3 rifles, which were not equipped with the proper telescopic sights or night vision scopes for a precision nighttime operation. The intelligence was also catastrophically flawed. The police believed there were only 4 or 5 terrorists. They had no idea there were actually 8. They had therefore only positioned 5 snipers around the airfield, a number that was completely insufficient to neutralize the larger group of terrorists in a single coordinated volley. And most damningly, the Boeing 727 that was waiting on the tarmac, the one that was supposed to be the centerpiece of the ruse, was completely unprepared for a rescue assault. The plan had been to hide a team of armed police officers, disguised as the flight crew, inside the plane. But at the last minute, the police team, realizing the mission was a suicidal one with no cover and no viable escape plan, had mutinied and had abandoned their positions, leaving the plane completely empty. No one bothered to inform the tactical commanders on the ground of this critical development. As the 2 helicopters carrying the 4 terrorists and their 9 bound and blindfolded Israeli hostages lifted off from the Olympic Village and flew into the dark night sky, they were heading not toward a well-planned rescue, but toward a poorly planned, ill-equipped, and ultimately disastrous ambush. The final, tragic act of the Munich massacre was about to begin. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on the night of September 5th, the 2 German military helicopters, carrying the hopes of a watching world and the lives of 13 men, descended into the harsh, artificial light of the Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base. The scene on the tarmac was one of tense, almost theatrical, unreality. The Boeing 727 sat waiting under the powerful airfield lights, a silent, empty stage for the final act. The 5 German police snipers were in their positions, one on the roof of the control tower and 4 others lying prone on the flat expanse of the airfield, their rifles trained on the landing zone. The helicopters touched down about 100 yards from the waiting jet. The doors opened, and the first stage of the transfer began. 2 of the Black September terrorists emerged from the first helicopter and walked cautiously toward the Boeing 727, their weapons at the ready. Their job was to inspect the plane, to ensure it was fueled and that there was no trap. They boarded the empty aircraft and, to their surprise and likely, their growing suspicion, they found no flight crew. The plane was completely empty. This was not what they had been promised. It was at this moment, with the 2 terrorists inside the empty plane and the remaining 6 still in or near the helicopters with the hostages, that the German tactical commanders realized their plan was based on a catastrophic intelligence failure. They now saw that there were not 4 or 5 terrorists, as they had believed all day, but a total of 8. Their 5 snipers were completely outnumbered, a fact that made the plan for a single, coordinated, and successful takedown almost impossible. The 2 terrorists who had inspected the plane, realizing it was a trap, sprinted back from the Boeing 727 toward the helicopters, shouting to their comrades. The German commanders, their flawed plan now completely unraveling, had no choice. They gave the order to open fire. At 11:03 p.m., the night erupted. The German snipers began to shoot. Their first volley was chaotic and largely ineffective. The darkness, the distance, and their lack of proper equipment made precision shooting impossible. They managed to hit one of the terrorists who was returning from the plane, wounding him in the thigh. Another terrorist who was standing on the tarmac was also hit, but the others, including the two helicopter pilots, were unhurt and immediately returned fire, their automatic AK-47s spraying bullets across the airfield. One of the terrorists shot out the airfield lights, plunging much of the scene into a confusing, terrifying darkness, punctuated by the muzzle flashes of the ongoing gunfight. The initial sniper assault had failed to neutralize the threat. Instead, it had triggered a full-blown, chaotic battle on an open airfield, with the 9 Israeli hostages still bound and helpless inside the 2 helicopters, caught in the deadly crossfire. For the next hour, a fierce, disorganized gunfight raged. The German police, with no clear plan and a fractured command structure, were completely outmaneuvered. They had no armored vehicles to approach the helicopters, and their snipers were unable to get clear shots at the terrorists, who were using the helicopters and the bodies of the German pilots as cover. One of the snipers on the ground was tragically killed by a stray bullet from one of his own colleagues. Inside the helicopters, the situation for the hostages was one of unimaginable terror. They were bound, blindfolded, and could only listen to the sounds of the battle raging around them. The whiz of bullets, the shouts, the explosions, a symphony of a rescue attempt that was going catastrophically, fatally wrong. Around midnight, the Germans, in a desperate move, called for armored personnel carriers to be brought to the scene. The vehicles arrived, but their progress was slow. As the first of the armored cars finally rolled onto the tarmac, the terrorists knew that their situation was hopeless. They had no escape and their mission was over. And in a final, brutal act of vengeance, they decided to execute their prisoners. One of the terrorists, the leader Isa, jumped into the doorway of the first helicopter, the one that held 4 of the Israeli hostages. He turned, raised his Kalashnikov rifle, and raked the inside of the helicopter with gunfire, murdering the 4 bound men at point-blank range. He then pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it into the cockpit. The helicopter erupted in a massive, fiery explosion, the fireball a horrifying echo of the violence that had just occurred inside. The fate of the remaining 5 hostages in the second helicopter is a matter of some confusion, lost in the chaos of the final moments. Some reports indicate that another terrorist shot and killed them as the police closed in. Other accounts suggest they may have died from smoke inhalation or from the crossfire. But the result was the same. All 9 of the Israeli hostages were dead. In the final, chaotic moments of the gunfight, the German police finally managed to kill 5 of the 8 Black September terrorists. The remaining 3, 2 of whom were wounded, were captured and taken into custody. The Battle of Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base was over, but the news that was initially and tragically relayed to the world was a lie. In the confusion of the moment, a German government spokesman, in a desperate attempt to project an image of success, announced to the press that the rescue attempt had been a success and that all the hostages were safe. For a brief, joyful period, the world, including the families of the hostages in Israel, celebrated. But the truth could not be contained for long. A few hours later, in the deep of the night, a new and final announcement was made. The rescue had been a catastrophic failure. All 11 of the Israeli hostages, the 2 who had been murdered in the Olympic Village and the 9 who had been killed on the airfield, were dead. Also dead were 1 German police officer and 5 of the terrorists. The Munich massacre, which had begun with an act of terrorism, had ended in a bloodbath, a tragedy compounded by the incompetence of a rescue attempt that had failed at every conceivable level. The games of peace and joy had become the games of blood and fire. The aftermath of the Munich massacre was a period of profound global shock, grief, and a bitter, angry reckoning. The Olympic Games, which were supposed to be a symbol of international unity and peaceful competition, had been transformed into a stage for political violence and a showcase of almost unbelievable government incompetence. The world, which had watched the tragedy unfold on live television, was left to grapple with the horrifying reality that no place, not even the sacred ground of the Olympics, was immune to the brutal realities of modern terrorism. In the immediate aftermath, a fierce debate raged over the fate of the Games themselves. The International Olympic Committee, in a controversial decision, announced that the Games would continue. At a memorial service held in the main Olympic Stadium the next day, a service that was attended by 80,000 grieving spectators and the remaining athletes, the IOC president, Avery Brundage, famously declared, "The Games must go on." The decision was seen by many, particularly by the Israeli delegation and the families of the victims, as a callous and deeply disrespectful act, a decision to prioritize the spectacle of the Games over a proper period of mourning for the 11 murdered men. The remaining members of the Israeli team immediately withdrew from the competition and flew home, their coffins on a separate plane. For West Germany, the massacre was a national trauma of the highest order. The Games of peace and joy had become a source of profound national shame. The country was condemned internationally for its disastrously inept handling of the crisis. The litany of failures was staggering. The naive lack of security, the failure of the first rescue attempt, the flawed intelligence, the poorly equipped snipers, and the final chaotic bloodbath at the Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base. The tragedy exposed the deep, systemic weaknesses in Germany's domestic security apparatus and served as a brutal, necessary wake-up call. In the direct aftermath of the massacre, West Germany created GSG-9, a highly trained, professional, and permanent counterterrorism and special operations unit, a force designed to ensure that the country would never again be so catastrophically unprepared to deal with a similar crisis. For Israel, the massacre was a declaration of war. The government of Prime Minister Golda Meir was not content to let the world forget or to let the perpetrators of the attack escape justice. In a secret meeting of her cabinet, a new and deeply covert policy was authorized. Israel would hunt down and eliminate every single person who was responsible for planning and executing the Munich massacre. This led to the creation of a series of secret Mossad assassination units, a campaign that would be known as Operation Wrath of God. For the next 2 decades, Israeli intelligence agents would track the members of Black September and the PLO across Europe and the Middle East, carrying out a series of targeted assassinations. They used car bombs, phone bombs, and direct, close-quarters killings. The campaign was a shadowy, morally ambiguous, and often brutal war of retribution, a story that would itself become the stuff of legend and the subject of books and films, most notably Steven Spielberg's 2005 film Munich. The fate of the 3 surviving terrorists who had been captured at the airfield was a final, infuriating insult to the victims' families. Just a few weeks after the massacre, in October of 1972, a Lufthansa passenger jet was hijacked by other members of Black September. They demanded the release of the 3 Munich terrorists. The West German government, in a move that was widely seen as a capitulation, and which some have speculated was a prearranged deal to get Germany out of the middle of the conflict, quickly complied. The 3 captured terrorists were released and flown to Libya, where they were greeted as heroes. They had, in the end, escaped justice completely. The legacy of the Munich massacre was profound and far-reaching. It was a watershed moment in the history of modern terrorism. It demonstrated, on a global stage, the immense power of a small, determined group to use a high-profile, symbolic event to hijack the world's media and to force their political cause onto the international agenda. The image of the hooded terrorist on the balcony of the Olympic Village became an enduring, iconic symbol of a new era of political violence. The massacre forever changed the nature of security at all major international events. The era of open, friendly Olympics was over, replaced by a new, permanent reality of high fences, heavily armed guards, metal detectors, and a massive, often invisible security apparatus. The tragedy at Munich was the beginning of the securitization of public life, a process that would only accelerate in the decades to come. For the families of the 11 Israeli athletes and officials, the journey has been a long and painful one. For decades, they fought for a proper, official acknowledgement of their loved one's sacrifice from the International Olympic Committee. It was not until 2016, 44 years after the massacre, that the IOC at the Rio de Janeiro Games held a formal, official moment of mourning for the victims in the Olympic Village. The story of the Munich massacre remains a dark and sorrowful chapter in the history of the modern world. It is a story of a utopian dream of peace that was shattered by the brutal intrusion of a deep-seated and intractable political hatred. It is a story of profound and tragic incompetence, a testament to the deadly consequences of being unprepared in the face of a new and ruthless enemy. And it is, most of all, a human story, the story of 11 men, coaches, athletes, fathers, and sons, who came to a festival of peace in the name of sport, and who were instead sacrificed on the altar of a brutal and unending political war. Their memory is a permanent, sorrowful reminder that the Olympic flame, for all its symbolic power, is sometimes no match for the fires of a world that will not, and cannot, forget its own history. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, the morning of Friday, November 22, 1963, broke over Dallas, Texas with a clean, brilliant sunshine that had burned off the last of the morning's rain. The city was alive with a nervous, electric energy. This was a day of immense political importance, a day for Dallas to put its best face forward. The President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was in town. The trip was a political necessity. Texas was a critical and deeply fractured state for the Democratic Party, and with the 1964 election looming on the horizon, the Kennedy administration needed to mend fences, to project an image of unity and strength. The president, at 46, was the very embodiment of a new American generation. Youthful, charismatic, and radiating an almost incandescent sense of vigor and optimism, he was the head of a political dynasty that the press had nicknamed Camelot, a modern-day court of culture, intelligence, and power. With him was his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, a figure of almost mythical grace and style, her quiet elegance a perfect counterpoint to her husband's boisterous charm. Also in their party were Texas Governor John Connally and his wife, Nellie. The Texas tour had, so far, been a resounding success. The crowds in San Antonio and Houston had been massive, warm, and enthusiastic. The morning's breakfast in Fort Worth had been a triumph. Now, all that was left was a short flight to Dallas's Love Field Airport, followed by a motorcade through the city's downtown to a luncheon at the Trade Mart. It was a routine political event, a public performance that had been played out in 100 other cities. Just before noon, Air Force One touched down at Love Field. The President and the First Lady emerged into the bright Texas sun to the roar of a massive, welcoming crowd. Jackie, in her now iconic pink Chanel suit and matching pillbox hat, was presented with a bouquet of red roses. The mood was one of celebration, of a city eager to show its affection for the young president. The political tensions that had simmered beneath the surface seemed to have vanished in the bright, warm sunshine of the day. The motorcade was assembled. The centerpiece was the presidential limousine, a specially modified, open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible, codenamed SS-100X by the Secret Service. It was a gleaming, midnight blue symbol of American power and, in retrospect, of a shocking and almost naive vulnerability. In the back seat sat President Kennedy and the First Lady. In the jump seats directly in front of them were Governor Connally and his wife. The car was an open stage, its occupants completely exposed to the thousands of cheering people who lined the streets. The motorcade began its slow, 10-mile journey through the city. The route was a parade of adulation. The streets were packed, the crowds cheering, waving, holding up handmade signs. The president, a master of retail politics, was in his element, smiling, waving, his face radiating the easy, confident charm that had captivated the world. At one point, Nellie Connally, turning to the president from her seat in front of him, made a simple, happy observation that would become one of the most poignant and haunting phrases in American history. "Mr. President," she said with a smile, "you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." "No, you certainly can't," Kennedy replied, his final words. A few moments later, at approximately 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, the presidential limousine made a slow, tight, 120-degree left turnoff of Houston Street and onto Elm Street. It had just entered a small, strangely configured, three-sided plaza known as Dealey Plaza. The plaza was a geographical oddity, a patch of green space surrounded by a strange collection of buildings and overpasses. To the right of the motorcade was a sloping, grassy hill that would come to be known as the Grassy Knoll. Straight ahead was a triple underpass that would carry Elm Street out of the downtown core. And looming up and behind them, on the corner of Houston and Elm, was a hulking, 7-story, red brick building, a warehouse that served as the Texas School Book Depository. The crowd in Dealey Plaza was thinner than it had been on the main downtown streets. The limousine, having just made the sharp turn, had slowed to a crawl, its speed dropping to just over 11 miles per hour. The president was still waving to the small clusters of people on the side of the road. He was a perfect, slow-moving target. And then, the clear, bright air of the Dallas afternoon was split by a sound that did not belong. A sharp, cracking report, like a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. For a fraction of a second, there was only confusion. Most of the people in the crowd, and even in the motorcade, did not immediately recognize the sound as a rifle shot. But in the back of the presidential limousine, the reality of what was happening was beginning to unfold in a horrifying, slow-motion ballet of violence. The first shot, it is now believed, missed the car entirely. But the second shot, fired from a high-powered, bolt-action rifle, found its mark. The bullet entered President Kennedy's upper back, tore through his neck, and then exited his throat. He stopped waving. His hands flew up to his neck in a convulsive, almost reflexive gesture, his elbows held high. He made no sound, his face a mask of pained confusion. Governor Connolly, sitting directly in front of him, also felt the impact. The same bullet, it is theorized by the Warren Commission, then passed through his chest, shattered his wrist, and lodged in his thigh. He slumped forward, crying out, "My God, they're going to kill us all." For 4 agonizing seconds, the world seemed to be suspended in a state of surreal, almost silent horror. Jackie Kennedy, sitting beside her husband, was looking at him, a look of profound confusion on her face. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, riding on the running board of the car behind them, saw the president's reaction and began to run, desperately trying to reach the back of the limousine to shield him. And then the third and final shot rang out. This was the shot that would be seared into the memory of a nation, the moment captured in all its grotesque, frame-by-frame horror by a local dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder and his home movie camera. The bullet struck the back of President Kennedy's head in a massive, explosive impact. A plume of blood, bone, and brain matter erupted from the right side of his head, creating a ghastly pinkish halo in the bright Texas sun. His body was thrown violently backward and to the left, slumping over into his wife's lap. The scene in the back of the limousine was now one of pure, unrestrained horror. Jackie Kennedy, in a moment of pure, animal shock and instinct, began to climb out of her seat and onto the flat trunk of the car. She was not trying to escape. She would later say, trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull that had been blown off by the impact. It was at that moment that Secret Service agent Clint Hill finally reached the car. He scrambled onto the back, pushing the First Lady back down into the relative safety of the seat, and then shielded their bodies with his own as the limousine, its driver finally realizing what had happened, accelerated violently, speeding under the triple underpass and toward the nearest hospital. In the few chaotic seconds of the assassination, a world had been shattered. The age of Camelot, with its promise of a new, more hopeful future, had just been brutally and very publicly executed in a sun-drenched plaza in Dallas. The motorcade, which had begun as a parade of celebration, was now a frantic, screaming race for a life that was already gone. And in the window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, a lone, shadowy figure had just set in motion a mystery that would haunt the American psyche for the rest of the century and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of the shots in Dealey Plaza, a wave of chaos and disbelief washed over the scene. The cheering of the crowd was replaced by the sound of screams, of shouts, of people running for cover, their minds struggling to process the horror they had just witnessed. In the chaos, the source of the shots was a matter of profound and immediate confusion. Some witnesses on the ground, their senses disoriented by the echoing reports, believed the shots had come from the grassy knoll. Police officers, their guns drawn, scrambled up the small hill, searching for a gunman who was not there. But high above the plaza on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, at least one witness had a clearer view. A construction worker named Howard Brennan, who had been watching the motorcade from across the street, saw a man in the southeastern corner window of the 6th floor. He saw him take aim with a rifle and he saw him fire. Inside the depository building, the scene was one of quiet, internal chaos. In the moments after the shooting, a Dallas police officer, Marion Baker, who had been riding a motorcycle in the motorcade, raced into the building. Accompanied by the building's superintendent, he began a frantic, floor-by-floor search for the shooter. On the 2nd floor lunchroom, just 90 seconds after the final shot was fired, he encountered a young man, standing calmly by a soda machine. The man was not out of breath. His demeanor was cool and unruffled. The superintendent identified the man as an employee. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. The officer, seeing nothing suspicious, let him go and continued his search up the stairs. It was a fleeting, almost mundane encounter, a brief near-miss with the man who was, at that moment, the most wanted man in the world. While the police were still swarming the building, Lee Harvey Oswald calmly walked out the front door, boarded a city bus, and disappeared into the anonymous bustle of the city. His time at the book depository was over. He had, it seemed, simply melted away. Meanwhile, the presidential limousine, its siren screaming, raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital, just 4 miles away. It arrived at the emergency room at 12:36 p.m. The scene in the back of the car was a private, contained universe of horror. President Kennedy was slumped in his wife's lap, his head a massive, gaping wound. Governor Connolly was also severely wounded, bleeding profusely. The Secret Service agents and medical staff worked frantically, pulling the 2 men from the car and rushing them into Trauma Room 1. But for the president, it was already too late. The head wound was catastrophic and unsurvivable. A team of doctors worked desperately to revive him, but they knew it was hopeless. At 1 p.m., on November 22, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was officially pronounced dead. The news of his death was delivered to a stunned and weeping press corps by the Assistant Press Secretary. The official announcement sent a shockwave of grief and disbelief across the country and around the world. In an era before the 24-hour news cycle, the news spread in a slow, agonizing wave, through crackling radio reports, through wire service bulletins, and in the solemn, choked-up voice of the CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who famously removed his glasses to wipe away a tear as he read the official confirmation. The nation was plunged into a state of collective, almost paralytic shock. While the world began to mourn, the hunt for the killer was already underway in Dallas. The search had quickly focused on the Texas School Book Depository. On the 6th floor, in the southeastern corner window, investigators found the sniper's nest. 3 spent rifle cartridges lay on the floor, and hidden behind a stack of book cartons, they found the murder weapon, a cheap, Italian-made, 6.5mm Mannlicher Carcano bolt-action rifle, fitted with a crude, 4-power telescopic sight. The police now had the weapon, and they soon had a suspect. A roll call of the depository employees was conducted, and only one man was missing, the quiet, unassuming 24-year-old order filler who had been hired just a month earlier, Lee Harvey Oswald. A bulletin was immediately put out for his arrest. Oswald, in the meantime, had made his way back to the rooming house where he was living. He went to his small room, grabbed a pistol, and then headed back out onto the streets. His next actions were those of a man in a state of desperate and increasingly violent flight. At approximately 1:15 p.m., about 45 minutes after the assassination, a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit was on patrol in the Oak Cliff neighborhood, a few miles from Dealey Plaza. He spotted a man walking down the street who matched the general description of the assassination suspect. Officer Tippit pulled his patrol car over to question the man. As Tippit got out of his car, the man, Lee Harvey Oswald, pulled out his .38 revolver and, without a word, shot and killed the police officer, firing 4 times at close range. The murder of Officer Tippit was a brazen, desperate, and utterly senseless act. The crime of a man who knew he was being hunted. Oswald then fled the scene on foot. A frantic manhunt began in the Oak Cliff neighborhood, with police swarming the area. Several witnesses had seen the Tippit shooting, and they all pointed the police in the same direction. Oswald, trying to escape, ducked into the darkness of the Texas Theater, a local movie house, without paying. The ticket taker, seeing him sneak in, called the police. Within minutes, the theater was surrounded. The house lights came up, and the police began a row-by-row search. They found him sitting alone in the back of the theater. As they approached, he stood up, shouted, "Well, it is all over now." And then, in a final, desperate act of defiance, he threw a punch at one officer and tried to pull out his revolver before he was overwhelmed and subdued. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and taken to the Dallas Police Headquarters. He was now the sole suspect in 2 murders: the assassination of the President of the United States and the cold-blooded killing of a Dallas police officer. In the interrogation rooms at the police headquarters, Oswald was a strange, defiant, and deeply enigmatic figure. He was not a ranting madman. He was calm, intelligent, and almost smugly arrogant. He denied everything. He denied killing President Kennedy. He denied killing Officer Tippit. He claimed he was a patsy, an innocent man who was being set up to take the fall for a crime he did not commit. Over the next 2 days, he was subjected to hours of questioning, but he never cracked. He never confessed. He stuck to his story, a lone, defiant voice of denial in a world that had already universally convicted him. The evidence against him was mounting, but the man at the center of the storm remained a frustrating and deeply unsettling enigma. While Lee Harvey Oswald was being interrogated in the chaotic, media-saturated environment of the Dallas Police Headquarters, the machinery of a nation in mourning was grinding into motion. On the afternoon of November 22nd, in a somber, hastily arranged ceremony aboard Air Force One as it sat on the tarmac at Love Field, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. Standing beside him, her pink suit still stained with her husband's blood, was the stoic, grief-stricken figure of Jacqueline Kennedy. The peaceful transfer of power, the bedrock of the American democratic system, had been maintained, but it was a transition born from an act of profound and violent disruption. The plane then took off, carrying the body of the fallen president back to Washington. The entire world was plunged into a period of shared, televised grief. For 4 days, the nation was united in a collective, almost religious, state of mourning. The networks canceled all their regular programming and commercials, broadcasting instead the solemn, non-stop coverage of the funeral preparations. The images from that weekend are now permanently etched into the American psyche. The flag-draped casket lying in state in the rotunda of the Capitol, the riderless horse, Black Jack, with boots reversed in the stirrups, the quiet, heartbreaking salute of 3-year-old John F. Kennedy Jr. as his father's caisson passed by. It was a national trauma, a moment of shared loss so profound that it would define a generation. But back in Dallas, the story was taking another, even more bizarre and unsettling turn. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man at the center of this global tragedy, remained an impenetrable enigma. The case against him, while circumstantial, was becoming overwhelmingly strong. His palm print was found on the rifle that had been discovered in the book depository. Fibers from his shirt matched fibers found in the sniper's nest. The rifle had been purchased by him under an alias through a mail-order catalog. And he was, of course, the prime suspect in the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit, a crime for which there were multiple eyewitnesses. Yet, Oswald continued to deny everything. His cool, defiant smirk a frustrating and infuriating mask. The police and the world were desperate for answers, for a confession, for a motive, for some kind of explanation that could make sense of the senseless. They would never get one. On the morning of Sunday, November 24th, 2 days after the assassination, the Dallas police made a decision that, in retrospect, was a catastrophic failure of security and judgment. They decided to transfer Oswald from the city jail in the police headquarters to the more secure county jail. The transfer was a massive media event. The basement of the police headquarters was a chaotic scrum of reporters, photographers, and television cameras, all jostling for a position to catch a glimpse of the most infamous man in the world. At 11:21 a.m., Oswald, handcuffed and flanked by two detectives, was led out into the glare of the television lights. As he stepped forward, a figure, a man in a dark suit and a fedora, suddenly lunged from the crowd of reporters. The man had a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver in his hand. He pushed it against Oswald's side and, at point-blank range, he fired a single shot. The scene, which was being broadcast live to a horrified national television audience, was one of pure, surreal chaos. Oswald collapsed to the ground, a look of pained shock on his face, a mortal wound in his abdomen. The shooter was immediately swarmed by a sea of police officers. It was a second, shocking act of violence, a murder committed in the heart of the Dallas police headquarters, in front of the entire world. The shooter was not a political assassin or a shadowy conspirator. He was a 52-year-old Dallas nightclub owner and small-time mob associate named Jack Ruby. Ruby was a well-known figure in the Dallas underworld, a man with a reputation for a short temper and a desperate, almost pathetic craving for the spotlight. His stated motive for killing Oswald was a simple, and for many a deeply unbelievable one. He claimed he had been so overcome with grief and rage over Kennedy's death that he had wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the ordeal of having to return to Dallas to testify at Oswald's trial. He was, in his own telling, a grieving patriot, a man who had taken the law into his own hands in a fit of righteous, emotional passion. Lee Harvey Oswald was rushed to the same hospital, Parkland Memorial, where President Kennedy had been taken just 2 days earlier. He died on the operating table a short time later. The man who held the secrets to the Kennedy assassination was now permanently silenced. The only person who could have definitively told the world who he was, what he had done, and why he had done it was gone. His death did not provide closure. It did the opposite. It created a permanent, unfillable void at the heart of the story. A void that would be immediately and forever filled with 1,000 competing conspiracy theories. The official story, the one that would be laid out in painstaking detail 10 months later by a presidential commission headed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, was a simple and, for many, a deeply unsatisfying one. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. They found that he had fired 3 shots from the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, and that one of those shots, the infamous single bullet or magic bullet, had been responsible for all of the non-fatal wounds to both President Kennedy and Governor Connally. They also concluded that Jack Ruby had acted alone, his actions motivated by a spontaneous fit of rage. There was, the commission stated, no evidence of any conspiracy, either domestic or foreign. The Warren Report was a monumental work of investigation, a 26-volume, meticulously detailed attempt to bring order and certainty to a chaotic and traumatic event. But from the moment it was published, it was met with a profound and enduring skepticism. The idea that a lone nut, a pathetic 24-year-old loser like Lee Harvey Oswald, could have single-handedly altered the course of world history was, for many, simply too random, too meaningless to accept. The crime was too big, its consequences too profound, for such a small and insignificant killer. The report's conclusions, particularly the single-bullet theory, seemed to defy the laws of physics and common sense. And the convenient public execution of the sole suspect before he could ever tell his story was a coincidence that was, for many, too great to be a coincidence at all. The official story felt like a cover-up, a neat, tidy, and government-approved narrative designed to calm a traumatized nation and to conceal a darker, more complex, and far more terrifying truth. The Warren Report, which was intended to be the final word on the Kennedy assassination, was, for a vast and growing number of people, just the beginning of a 50-year search for what really happened on that sunny Friday in Dealey Plaza. The Warren Commission's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted as a lone gunman did little to quell the storm of questions and doubts that surrounded the assassination. In fact, it had the opposite effect. The report's very insistence on a simple, singular explanation for such a monumental event seemed to create a vacuum, a space that was immediately filled by a vast and ever-expanding universe of alternative theories. The Kennedy assassination was not just a historical event. It became a national obsession, a great American whodunit, a puzzle that has been endlessly re-examined by a legion of professional historians, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists for more than half a century. The theories, in their vast and often contradictory range, reflect the deep political and social anxieties of the era in which they were born. In the years immediately following the assassination, the most prominent theories pointed the finger at the two great adversaries of the Cold War. Some believed the assassination was a plot orchestrated by the Soviet KGB, a direct act of retaliation for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Others were convinced it was the work of the Cuban government under Fidel Castro, a preemptive strike against a president who had repeatedly tried to overthrow his regime. These theories placed the assassination in a familiar, if terrifying, geopolitical context. But as the 1960s and 70s wore on, and as the American public's trust in its own government was shattered by the ongoing war in Vietnam and the revelations of the Watergate scandal, the focus of the conspiracy theories turned inward. The new narrative was a far more unsettling one: that President Kennedy had not been killed by a foreign enemy, but by a conspiracy within the deep, shadowy structures of the American government itself. A host of powerful, domestic players were cast in the role of the villain. The most enduring of these theories centered on the Central Intelligence Agency. Proponents of this theory argued that rogue elements within the CIA, still furious over Kennedy's failure to fully support the Bay of Pigs invasion and his perceived dovishness on Cuba and Vietnam, had decided to eliminate him. The fact that the CIA had a well-documented history of engaging in assassination plots against foreign leaders made the idea that they would turn their deadly skills inward seem, to many, not just plausible but likely. Another powerful theory pointed to the mafia. In this version of the story, organized crime leaders like Santo Trafficante Jr. and Carlos Marcello, who had been aggressively targeted by the Kennedy administration's Justice Department under the leadership of the president's own brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, decided to strike back. The fact that the mafia had, in a strange twist of history, been a secret partner with the CIA in the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, and that Jack Ruby had clear and documented ties to the mob, all lent a powerful, noir-like credibility to this theory. Other theories implicated a wide range of other players: anti-Castro Cuban exiles, right-wing Texas oil tycoons, and even, in one of the most persistent and powerful theories, the vice president himself, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was portrayed as a man so consumed by his ambition for the presidency that he was willing to kill for it. These theories were not just the stuff of fringe newsletters. In 1976, in the wake of the Watergate scandal, the U.S. House of Representatives formed the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, to reinvestigate the murders of both John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. after a 2-year investigation. The HSCA released its final report, and its conclusion was a bombshell. The committee agreed with the Warren Commission that Lee Harvey Oswald had fired the shots that killed the president. But, in a stunning and direct contradiction to the Warren report, they also concluded that there was a high probability that 2 gunmen fired at President John F. Kennedy, and that the assassination was likely the result of a conspiracy. The basis for this explosive conclusion was a new and controversial piece of acoustic evidence from a police radio recording, which a team of experts claimed contained the sound of a fourth, and therefore a second shooter's shot, likely fired from the grassy knoll. The HSCA, however, was unable to identify the nature or the members of this conspiracy. Their conclusion was a profound and deeply unsettling one. The president had been killed as part of a conspiracy, but the conspirators remained unknown, a nameless, faceless cabal that had gotten away with the perfect crime. The legacy of the Kennedy assassination is a profound and deeply sorrowful one. It was a moment of national trauma that, in many ways, has never fully healed. The assassination is often cited as the end of an era of American innocence and optimism, the moment when the bright, hopeful promise of the early 1960s was shattered, giving way to a decade of division, violence, and disillusionment. The image of the riderless horse, the salute of the small boy, the stoic, veiled grief of the young widow. These are images that are permanently seared into the national memory, symbols of a great and unfulfilled promise. The The endless and often obsessive search for a conspiracy is, in itself, a part of that legacy. The refusal to accept the lone nut theory is a testament to the profound need for a story that is equal to the scale of the tragedy. For many, the idea of a vast, powerful conspiracy, however terrifying, is more comforting than the alternative. The idea that history can be so easily and so randomly altered by the actions of a single, pathetic, and insignificant individual. The conspiracy theories provide a kind of order, a sense of meaning, to an act that feels, at its heart, completely and utterly meaningless. Today, Dealey Plaza is a national historic landmark, a place of pilgrimage for millions of visitors who come to stand on the grassy knoll, to look up at the sixth-floor window of the former Texas School Book Depository, and to try to make sense of the events that unfolded there. It is a place that is frozen in time, a permanent, physical reminder of the single, shocking moment when a nation's history was irrevocably changed. The case of who killed John F. Kennedy remains, for many, the great, unsolved American mystery, a story with 1,000 conflicting narratives, 1,000 shadowy suspects, and no final, satisfying answer. It is a deep and painful wound on the American psyche, a wound that, even after all these years, refuses to close, its secrets buried with a lone, enigmatic gunman in a forgotten grave, and with the powerful, unseen forces that may, or may not, have been standing behind him in the shadows. The Boston Marathon bombing. The city of Boston on the third Monday in April is a city in celebration. It is Patriots' Day, a unique Massachusetts holiday that commemorates the first battles of the American Revolution. A day steeped in the history of defiance and the promise of spring. And for more than a century, the centerpiece of this celebration has been the Boston Marathon. It is not just a race. It is a civic institution, a sprawling, 26.2-mile-long street festival that winds its way from the quiet, colonial town of Hopkinton to the bustling, historic heart of Boston. The air on Marathon Monday is a unique, electric cocktail of roaring crowds, of straining, athletic determination, and of a deep, almost familial, sense of community. It is a day when the entire city comes out to cheer, to hand out orange slices and cups of water, to shout encouragement to the thousands of runners. From the elite international champions to the charity runners and the weekend warriors, all pushing themselves to their absolute limits. April 15, 2013, was a perfect day for a marathon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the air cool and crisp. The race was in its final, triumphant stages. The elite runners had already crossed the finish line on Boylston Street. But now, in the mid-afternoon, the heart of the race was unfolding. This was the time when the vast, anonymous river of humanity, the thousands of ordinary people who had trained for months for this single day, were approaching their goal. The sidewalks along the final stretch were a dense, joyful wall of sound. A sea of spectators, families, friends, tourists, all leaning over the metal barricades, their faces a mixture of pride and excitement, their voices a roaring chorus of encouragement. Among the thousands gathered near the finish line was the Richard family. Bill and Denise Richard were there with their 3 young children, watching the runners, soaking in the festive atmosphere. Their 8-year-old son, Martin, a bright, thoughtful boy, had just made a poster with a simple, powerful message that seemed to capture the entire spirit of the day. "No more hurting people," it read. "Peace." He stood on the barricade, a small boy in a sea of celebration, his own small voice calling out to the exhausted runners. A few feet away stood 29-year-old Crystal Campbell, a restaurant manager from a nearby town. She was there with her best friend, Karen, to cheer on Karen's boyfriend as he completed the race. They had taken a picture just a few minutes earlier, their faces bright with laughter, a perfect snapshot of a happy, ordinary day. Also in the crowd was a 23-year-old graduate student from China named Lingzi Liu. She was studying mathematics and statistics at Boston University, a young woman who had traveled halfway around the world to pursue her dream of an American education. She and 2 friends had come to the finish line to experience their first Boston Marathon, to be a part of their new city's most iconic celebration. At 2:49 p.m., as the race clock ticked just past the 4-hour and 9-minute mark, the world on Boylston Street was torn apart. The first explosion was a deafening, concussive boom that erupted from the base of a flagpole near the Marathon Sports Store. Just yards from the finish line, a massive cloud of thick, white, sulfurous smoke billowed into the air. The ground shook. For a fraction of a second, there was only a stunned, ringing silence, a moment of collective cognitive dissonance as the minds of the thousands of people there tried to process a sound that did not belong. Was it a celebratory cannon? A transformer blowing? 12 seconds later, a second, identical explosion ripped through the crowd a block further down the street, outside the Forum restaurant. The answer was now absolute and terrifying. This was not an accident. This was an attack. The festive, joyful scene was transformed, in an instant, into a landscape of almost unimaginable horror. The celebratory cheers were replaced by the piercing, high-pitched screams of the wounded and the terrified. The air, which had been filled with the scent of sweat and spring, was now thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. The two bombs, which would later be identified as homemade pressure cooker bombs, packed with nails, ball bearings, and black powder, and hidden inside backpacks, had been designed for a single monstrous purpose: to inflict the maximum amount of human carnage. They were anti-personnel weapons, designed to act as a horizontal claymore mine, and they had been placed at the feet of a crowd of men, women, and children. The aftermath was a scene of almost medieval brutality. The sidewalks were a slick, bloody tableau of shredded limbs, of shrapnel wounds, of bodies torn apart by the force of the blast. The metal barricades that had been there to control the crowd were now twisted and bent, spattered with blood. The initial wave of panic, of people running for their lives, was quickly replaced by an almost unbelievable wave of heroism. First responders, police officers, and race volunteers, who had been just feet away from the blasts, ran toward the smoke, not away from it. Ordinary citizens, spectators who had been cheering just moments before, became battlefield medics. They ripped off their own shirts to use as tourniquets, tying off grievously wounded limbs to staunch the flow of blood. They lifted the barricades to use as makeshift stretchers, carrying the wounded away from the scene. A man in a cowboy hat, a peace activist named Carlos Arredondo, became an instant, iconic symbol of the civilian courage, as he was photographed vaulting a fence to help a young man whose legs had been blown off, pinching the man's severed artery closed with his own hands. The medical tent at the finish line, which had been set up to treat runners for dehydration and exhaustion, was transformed into a MASH unit, a frontline trauma hospital. The doctors and nurses, with their years of experience in marathon medicine, were uniquely and heroically equipped to deal with the horrific injuries of a bombing. They began the desperate, life-saving work of triage, of stabilizing the wounded, of making the impossible decisions about who could be saved. But some could not be saved. In the chaos of the immediate aftermath, it soon became clear that the attack had claimed its first lives. Crystal Campbell, the 29-year-old restaurant manager, was killed instantly in the first blast. Lingzi Liu, the young graduate student, was also killed. And in an act of almost unbearable, tragic irony, 8-year-old Martin Richard, the small boy who had made a sign that read "No more hurting people," was also killed. His mother and his younger sister, Jane, were grievously wounded, Jane's leg so badly damaged that it would later have to be amputated. As the wounded were rushed to hospitals across the city, a new kind of silence began to settle over Boylston Street. It was the silence of a crime scene. The heart of the city of Boston was now locked down, a landscape of abandoned race banners, of discarded water cups, and of the ghosts of a celebration that had been murdered in an instant. The race was over. A new, more terrifying kind of race had just begun. A massive, desperate, and nationwide manhunt for the two phantoms who had walked into a crowd of happy, innocent people and had left behind a legacy of terror, pain, and a city's unshakable, defiant resolve. In the hours and days that followed the bombing, the city of Boston was transformed. The normal, bustling rhythms of urban life were replaced by a state of high alert, a tense, mournful quiet that was punctuated by the constant, wailing symphony of sirens. The city was wounded, but it was also unified in a way it had not been for decades. A new, defiant mantra, "Boston Strong," began to appear everywhere, on signs, on t-shirts, in hashtags, a simple, powerful statement of a community's refusal to be broken by an act of terror. While the city grieved, the largest and most complex criminal investigation since the September 11th attacks was launched with a ferocious, almost unprecedented, intensity. A massive multi-agency task force was assembled, led by the FBI, but with the full, coordinated support of the Boston Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, and a host of other federal and local agencies. The investigation had a single, all-consuming objective: to find the people responsible for this act of war on a civilian population. The crime scene on Boylston Street was a vast, open-air forensic puzzle. For the next 10 days, the street remained a sealed-off, sterile zone, as hundreds of investigators meticulously combed through every inch of the blast sites. They were looking for the components of the bombs, for any clue, no matter how small, that could lead them to their makers. They sifted through the debris, the shattered glass, the blood-soaked pavement, and they recovered thousands of pieces of evidence. Fragments of a pressure cooker, pieces of a circuit board, BBs, nails, and the tattered, blackened remains of 2 backpacks. But the most critical evidence was not forensic. It was digital. In the 21st century, a crime committed in a public space is a crime committed in front of 1,000 unblinking electronic eyes. The investigators began the monumental task of collecting and analyzing every single piece of video and every photograph that had been taken near the finish line in the hours leading up to the attack. They gathered surveillance footage from every store and restaurant on Boylston Street. They put out a public call, and thousands of ordinary citizens, spectators who had been filming the race on their cell phones and digital cameras, sent in their files. The FBI set up a command post in Boston and began the painstaking, mind-numbing process of watching thousands of hours of video, of sifting through hundreds of thousands of digital images. They were looking for a needle in a digital haystack. They were searching for the moment when the 2 backpacks containing the bombs had been placed on the ground. They were looking for the faces of the phantoms who had carried them. After 2 days of nonstop, around-the-clock work, they found them. Working with analysts at the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI was able to isolate a series of images and video clips that showed 2 young men walking together through the crowds on Boylston Street, both carrying heavy-looking backpacks. The video showed them separating, each one moving toward one of the 2 blast sites. And then, it showed them walking away without their backpacks, just moments before the explosions. The images were grainy, but they were clear enough. The 2 men were young, with dark hair and baseball caps. The first, taller suspect was wearing a black baseball cap. The second, shorter suspect was wearing a white baseball cap, which he wore backwards. The FBI was now certain, the bombers. They had faces. They had suspect number 1 and suspect number 2, or, as they would come to be known in the media, white hat and black hat. The investigators now had their targets, but they had no idea who they were. They ran the images through every facial recognition database they had: driver's license photos, visa applications, terrorist watch lists, but they came up with no matches. The 2 men were ghosts. This created a fierce internal debate within the command structure of the investigation. Should they release the photos to the public? The risk was enormous. Releasing the photos could tip off the suspects, causing them to flee, to destroy evidence, or, most terrifyingly, to strike again. But the other risk was equally great. The longer they waited, the colder the trail would get. A member of the public, a neighbor, a friend, a former teacher, might be the only one who could put a name to the faces. On the afternoon of Thursday, April 18th, 3 days after the bombing, the FBI made its decision. They held a press conference, and for the first time, the world saw the faces of the 2 men they were looking for. The FBI released the photos and a short video clip, asking for the public's help in identifying them. Somebody out there knows these individuals. The special agent in charge, Richard Delorier, said, "For more than 100 years, the FBI has relied upon the public to be its eyes and its ears." The release of the photos was like throwing a match on a gas can. The internet exploded. A massive, crowdsourced, and often dangerously irresponsible online manhunt began. Users on sites like Reddit and 4chan began a frantic, frame-by-frame analysis of the photos, comparing them to images from the crowd, looking for any clue, any connection. This digital witch hunt quickly spun out of control as innocent people, who happened to bear a passing resemblance to the suspects, were wrongly identified and publicly accused, their lives and reputations threatened by a wave of online vigilantism. But the real identification was about to happen through a more traditional and far more reliable channel. The release of the photos had, as the FBI had feared, tipped off the suspects. They knew they had been seen. They knew their faces were now on every television screen in the country. Their anonymity was gone. And that night, their quiet, hidden life as a two-man terrorist cell was about to erupt into a new, and even more violent, public phase. The manhunt, which had been a quiet, digital search, was about to become a very real and very bloody chase through the streets of Boston. The two young men whose grainy images were now being broadcast around the world were brothers. They were Tamerlan and Jakar Tsarnaev. They were not foreign terrorists who had infiltrated the country. They were, in many ways, a product of it. Their family, of Chechen descent, had come to the United States as refugees in the early 2000s, seeking a new life away from the brutal, war-torn landscape of their homeland. They had settled in the working-class, multicultural city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, just across the river from Boston. Tamerlan, the elder brother, was 26. He was a talented amateur boxer, a man of intense, brooding charisma who had once dreamed of competing for the U.S. Olympic team, but his life had taken a darker turn. He had grown increasingly religious and had become consumed by a radical, militant interpretation of Islam. He had started to frequent extremist websites, absorbing the jihadi propaganda of groups like Al-Qaeda. He was a man who felt alienated from American society, a man who had come to see his adopted country as an enemy. He was the ideologue, the leader, the driving force behind the attack. Jakar, at 19, was a different case. To his friends, he was a normal, well-adjusted American kid. He was a popular student, the captain of his high school wrestling team, a young man known for his goofy sense of humor and his love of music and parties. He was a student at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He was, by all accounts, a follower, a younger brother who was deeply influenced and, ultimately, dominated by his older, more charismatic sibling. He was the quiet, almost casual accomplice. On the evening of April 18th, just a few hours after the FBI released their photos, the two brothers knew their time was running out. Their faces were now public. They had to make a move. Their plan, as it would later be pieced together, was a desperate and seemingly improvised one: to flee Boston and to make their way to New York City, where they intended to detonate more bombs in Times Square. Their final violent rampage began on the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. At approximately 10:30 p.m., they ambushed a 27-year-old MIT campus police officer named Sean Collier as he sat in his patrol car. They shot him multiple times at close range, killing him in a cold, senseless execution. Their motive, police believe, was to steal his service weapon, a plan that they ultimately failed to execute. The murder of Officer Collier was a declaration that they were not just bombers. They were killers, and they were willing to use lethal force to escape. A short time later, they carjacked a black Mercedes SUV. The driver of the car, a young Chinese entrepreneur named Dun Meng, was taken hostage. For the next 90 minutes, he was subjected to a terrifying, surreal ordeal as the two brothers drove him around the city, forcing him to withdraw money from ATMs and openly boasting to him that they were the Boston Marathon bombers. The carjacking, however, was a critical, and for the brothers, a fatal mistake. Dun Meng's cell phone was still in the car, and it was on. The police were able to track the phone's GPS signal, and for the first time since the bombing, they had a real-time, active location for their suspects. The brothers' plan began to unravel due to another, almost comically simple, mistake. They needed gas, but they didn't have enough cash. They pulled into a gas station, and as Tamerlan was distracted at the pump, Dun Meng, in an act of incredible, split-second courage, unbuckled his seatbelt, threw open the car door, and sprinted across the street to another, open gas station, screaming for the clerk to call 911. The brothers, their hostage now gone, panicked and sped off, but the police were already closing in. The carjacking had given them a description of the vehicle, and a police officer in the nearby town of Watertown spotted the black Mercedes SUV. A high-speed chase through the quiet, residential streets of Watertown began. The chase ended in a scene that was more suited to a war zone than to a suburban American neighborhood. The two brothers, their car now stopped, got out and began to engage the police in a furious, prolonged gunfight. The quiet, tree-lined street was transformed into a battlefield. They were heavily armed. They had a handgun, a semi-automatic rifle, and a collection of homemade pressure cooker bombs and pipe bombs, the same kind they had used at the marathon. They began throwing their bombs at the police, their explosions lighting up the night sky and sending shrapnel tearing through the houses and cars on the street. The gunfight was intense, with hundreds of rounds being exchanged. One police officer, Richard Donahue, was critically wounded. The battle reached its climax when Tamerlan, his gun having apparently jammed, charged directly at the police officers. He was tackled and taken to the ground. As the officers were struggling to handcuff him, Jakar, who had gotten back into the stolen Mercedes, did the unthinkable. He hit the gas and drove the 2-ton SUV directly at the group of officers who were holding his brother. The officers scrambled for cover. Jakar ran over his own brother, dragging his body for a short distance before speeding off into the darkness. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the mastermind of the Boston Marathon bombing, was taken to a nearby hospital, but his injuries were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead a short time later. Jakar, however, had escaped. He had abandoned the blood-soaked, bullet-riddled Mercedes a few blocks away and had vanished on foot. The most intense and surreal chapter of the manhunt was about to begin. The city of Boston and its surrounding suburbs were placed on an unprecedented, almost martial law-style lockdown. Public transportation was shut down. Businesses were closed. Residents were ordered to shelter in place, to lock their doors and stay away from their windows. An army of over 9,000 heavily armed police officers, state troopers, and federal agents, supported by armored vehicles and helicopters, began a systematic house-by-house, street-by-street search of the 20-square block area in Watertown where the suspect was believed to be hiding. The city of Boston, one of America's oldest and most vibrant metropolises, was now a ghost town, its silent, empty streets patrolled by a military-style force. The entire region was on edge, waiting and watching. One of the bombers was dead. The other, a wounded and likely very desperate 19-year-old boy, was hiding somewhere in their midst, a ghost in their own backyards. For an entire day, the city of Boston remained in a state of surreal, suspended animation. The massive house-by-house search for Jakar Tsarnaev, while thorough, had yielded nothing. As evening began to fall on Friday, April 19th, a sense of exhaustion and frustration was setting in. The authorities, with no new leads, made the decision to lift the shelter-in-place order. Residents were told they could finally leave their homes, but were urged to remain vigilant. The break in the case came not from a sophisticated police tactic, but from the simple, observant act of an ordinary citizen. A Watertown resident named David Henberry, who had been cooped up in his house all day, decided to step outside for some fresh air. He walked into his backyard and noticed that something was amiss with the large, shrink-wrapped boat that was parked on a trailer in his driveway. A strap on the boat cover had been cut. His heart pounding, he grabbed a stepladder and peered inside the boat. In the dim light under the boat cover, he saw a dark shape. It was a man, huddled in a corner, covered in blood. He immediately retreated, ran back into his house, and called 911. Within minutes, the quiet street on Franklin Street was swarming with a massive, tactical police presence. This was it. They had him cornered. A state police helicopter with a forward-looking infrared FLIR camera was brought in, and its thermal imaging confirmed the presence of a human body, still alive, inside the boat. What followed was a tense, hour-long standoff. The police, not knowing if the suspect was still armed or had more explosives, proceeded with extreme caution. They fired a volley of shots into the boat, and then used flashbang grenades in an attempt to disorient him. Finally, they were able to communicate with him, and a wounded, blood-soaked, and defeated Jakar Tsarnaev surrendered. He was taken into custody, and the 4-day-long reign of terror was finally over. The city of Boston erupted in a spontaneous, joyous celebration, its streets filled with cheering crowds, a cathartic release of a community that had been held hostage by fear. The legal proceedings that followed were long and complex. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was charged in federal court with 30 counts, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office, portrayed him as a cold, remorseless, and committed terrorist, a young man who had been radicalized by his older brother and had willingly participated in a monstrous act of violence against innocent civilians. They presented the overwhelming evidence against him. The video footage, the forensic evidence from the bombs, and, most chillingly, a note that he had scrawled on the inside of the boat while he was hiding. In the note, written in pencil on the boat's cabin walls, he had attempted to justify his actions, writing that the U.S. government was killing innocent Muslims and that the Boston attack was retribution for U.S. crimes. "I don't like killing innocent people," he wrote, "but the U.S. government is leading the way." The defense, led by the renowned anti-death penalty lawyer Judy Clark, did not deny that Dzhokhar had participated in the bombing. Instead, they pursued a strategy of mitigation, a legal argument designed to save him from the death penalty. They portrayed him as a lost, aimless young man who had been under the complete and total psychological domination of his older, more radicalized brother. Tamerlan, they argued, was the true mastermind, the driving force behind the attack. Dzhokhar was just a kid, a follower who had been swept up in his brother's violent, jihadist fantasy. They were not trying to excuse his actions, but to explain them, to cast him as a secondary and less culpable participant. The trial lasted for 2 months. In April 2015, the jury found Dzhokhar Tsarnaev guilty on all 30 counts. In the penalty phase, they were left to weigh the horrific, aggravating circumstances of the crime against the mitigating story of a young man manipulated by his older brother. In May 2015, they delivered their sentence. Death. The legacy of the Boston Marathon bombing is a profound and multi-layered one. It was a story of unimaginable terror and loss, a brutal intrusion of global ideological violence into the heart of a beloved American civic tradition. The attack left 3 people dead and more than 260 others wounded, many with life-altering injuries that would require years of painful rehabilitation. The murder of Officer Sean Collier and the wounding of Officer Richard Donahue were a stark reminder of the risks that law enforcement officers face every day. But the story of the bombing is also, and perhaps more powerfully, a story of incredible resilience, heroism, and community. The images of ordinary citizens rushing to help the wounded, of the medical personnel in the finish line tent performing battlefield triage, of a city coming together under the banner of Boston Strong. These are the images that have come to define the event. The bombing was an act designed to terrorize and to divide, but in Boston it had the opposite effect. It brought the city together, forging a new and powerful sense of shared identity and resolve. The manhunt that followed the bombing was a landmark event in the history of modern law enforcement. It was a demonstration of the incredible power of a coordinated, multi-agency response, and it was a powerful, if at times chaotic, example of the new role that public-sourced digital evidence plays in a 21st century investigation. The 4 days between the bombing and the capture of the second suspect were a period of intense, shared, and televised drama, a real-life thriller that captivated the entire world. Today, the Boston Marathon is a stronger, more vibrant, and more meaningful event than ever before. The finish line on Boylston Street, once a scene of carnage, is now a symbol of the city's resilience. The victims and their families have shown a remarkable strength, many of them becoming powerful advocates for peace and for the support of trauma survivors. The story of the bombing is a permanent, sorrowful part of the city's history, but it is a story that is not defined by the act of terror itself, but by the extraordinary way in which an American city and its people responded to it with courage, with compassion, and with a quiet, unshakable strength. The Deepwater Horizon disaster. In the deep, silent expanse of the Gulf of Mexico, about 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana, there stood a monument to the furthest reaches of human ambition. It was not a monument of stone or bronze, but of steel, a floating, semi-submersible cathedral of industrial might named the Deepwater Horizon. It was one of the most advanced and sophisticated offshore drilling rigs in the world, a technological marvel that could drill in water depths of up to 8,000 feet and to a total depth of 30,000 feet, plunging its steel proboscis deeper into the Earth's crust than any that had come before it. It was a city at sea, a massive, complex machine operated by a crew of 126 men and women, all working at the very frontier of the global quest for oil. The rig, which was owned and operated by the Swiss-based company Transocean, was under contract to one of the largest and most powerful energy companies on the planet, British Petroleum, or BP. They were drilling an exploratory well in a prospect known as Macondo, a name that, with its echoes of the fated mythical town in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, would prove to be a chillingly apt piece of corporate nomenclature. The Macondo well was a project of immense difficulty and immense promise. The oil and gas reservoir lay more than 18,000 feet below the surface of the water, a high-pressure, high-temperature environment that pushed the limits of engineering. It was a well that was notoriously wild, one that had been fighting them every step of the way. The project was over 6 weeks behind schedule and more than $50 million over budget. And for a company like BP, a company with a corporate culture that was famously, and often ruthlessly, focused on the bottom line, every day of delay was a day of hemorrhaging profits. On the evening of April 20th, 2010, the long, difficult process of drilling the Macondo well was finally coming to an end. The crew of the Deepwater Horizon was in the final stages of a delicate and dangerous procedure: the temporary sealing and abandonment of the well. They had drilled the hole, and now they had to plug it with a series of cement seals, a final, crucial step designed to contain the immense, volatile pressure of the oil and gas reservoir below until a production rig could come and tap it at a later date. The atmosphere on the rig that evening was a mixture of relief and a low, simmering tension. The crew was tired. They were ready to move on to the next job. But there was also a deep sense of unease. The well had been a constant source of problems, and the pressure from the BP executives, the company men on the rig, to cut corners, to speed up the process, and to save money, was a constant, palpable force. The culture of the rig was a clash of two competing priorities: the safety-conscious, by-the-book procedures of the veteran Transocean drilling crew, and the profit-driven, schedule-obsessed demands of their client BP. That evening, this clash of cultures was reaching its breaking point over a single critical test: the negative pressure test. This was a final, crucial safety check designed to ensure the integrity of the well's primary cement seal at the bottom. The procedure was simple in theory. They would reduce the pressure in the drill pipe to see if the cement plug would hold back the immense upward pressure of the gas from the reservoir. A successful test would show the pressure remaining stable. A failed test would indicate a leak, a sign that the cement had not sealed properly and that highly flammable methane gas was seeping into the wellbore. The first negative pressure test was conducted, and it failed. The pressure on the drill pipe, which should have been 0, was showing 1,400 pounds per square inch. This was a massive red flag. It was a clear, unambiguous signal that the well was not secure, that gas was flowing into it from the reservoir. It was, as one of the crew members would later say, the well telling us that it was coming. A tense, heated argument broke out on the drill floor between the Transocean crew, led by the rig's senior tool pusher, Jimmy Harrell, a veteran driller with a deep respect for the unforgiving physics of his job, and the senior BP company man on the rig, Donald Vidrine. The Transocean crew was adamant. The test had failed, and the well was not safe, but the BP executives, under immense pressure to finish the job and move the multimillion-dollar-a-day rig to its next location, offered a different, more convenient interpretation of the data. They argued that the pressure reading was not a leak, but a phenomenon known as the bladder effect, a false pressure reading caused by the compression of the fluid in the pipe. It was a theory that was convenient, but it defied the fundamental laws of physics. The two sides were at a stalemate, a conflict between the cautious, experienced men who worked the rig and the managers who were watching the clock. After a second, equally ambiguous test, the BP executive Donald Vidrine made a fateful and ultimately catastrophic decision. He declared the test a success. He overruled the deep, instinctual misgivings of the veteran drilling crew. He gave the order to proceed with the final stages of abandoning the well. This decision set in motion a deadly, unstoppable chain of events. Believing the well to be secure, the crew began the process of displacing the heavy, dense drilling mud from the wellbore with much lighter seawater. The drilling mud was the well's primary defense, a heavy column of fluid that acted as a cap, holding the immense pressure of the reservoir at bay. Replacing it with seawater was like removing the cork from a champagne bottle that had been shaken for a month. At approximately 9:45 p.m., the well, which had been trying to tell them for hours that it was not sealed, finally gave way completely. A massive, high-pressure bubble of methane gas, which had been seeping through the faulty cement seal at the bottom of the well for hours, now had an open path to the surface. It shot up the 18,000-foot drill pipe with the speed and force of a freight train. On the rig floor, the first sign of the impending disaster was a series of violent shudders. The entire massive rig began to shake. Then came the sound, a deafening, high-pitched hiss, as the gas, followed by a geyser of drilling mud, sand, and crude oil, erupted from the drill pipe and onto the rig floor. The air was filled with the choking, unmistakable smell of gas. The rig's automated gas alarms began to scream. A frantic, desperate attempt was made to activate the blowout preventer, a massive 450-ton stack of shear rams and valves on the seafloor that was the rig's last line of defense, the one thing designed to sever the pipe and seal the well in a catastrophic emergency. It failed to work. For a few terrifying seconds, the crew was in a state of suspended chaos, trying to comprehend the scale of the disaster that was unfolding. The gas cloud, which was lighter than air, quickly rose and enveloped the entire rig, flowing into the engine rooms where the massive diesel generators that powered the city at sea were still running. At 9:49 p.m., the inevitable happened. The gas found an ignition source. The deep-water horizon erupted in a massive, brilliant, and horrifying fireball. The explosion was a violent, concussive wave of force that ripped through the rig, tearing apart steel, shattering equipment, and plunging the entire platform into a state of absolute, fiery chaos. The men and women who had been working just moments before were now in the heart of a raging inferno, a floating, man-made hell in the middle of the dark, empty ocean. The worst offshore oil disaster in American history had just begun. The explosion that tore through the deep-water horizon was not a single, contained event. It was a cascade of fire and destruction. The initial blast, likely ignited by the diesel engines, triggered a series of secondary explosions as the massive cloud of methane and crude oil that had enveloped the rig found new sources of ignition. The platform, a symbol of industrial precision, was transformed in an instant into a labyrinth of burning, melting steel. For the 126 men and women on board, the world was reduced to a primal, terrifying struggle for survival. The blast had knocked out the main power, plunging much of the rig into a disorienting darkness, a darkness that was punctuated by the roaring, orange glare of the fires. The air was a thick, choking mixture of smoke and toxic fumes. The noise was a deafening, continuous roar, the sound of a giant, industrial beast in its death throes. On the drill floor, the area at the very epicenter of the blowout, the destruction was absolute. The men who had been working there were either killed instantly in the blast or were faced with an impossible, fiery escape. On the bridge, the rig's command center, the officers were thrown across the room by the force of the explosion, their control panels dead, their communications severed. But amidst the chaos and the terror, a series of almost unbelievable acts of heroism began to unfold. The crew, trained for years in emergency procedures, began to fight back. The rig's chief mate, who had been on the bridge, managed to activate the general alarm, its whooping siren a desperate signal to the rest of the crew to abandon the rig. The chief engineer, though severely injured, made his way to a backup generator and managed to restore some of the rig's power, bringing a dim, flickering light to the smoke-filled corridors. And then there was the story of the rig's 28-year-old chief electronics technician, Mike Williams, whose harrowing escape would later be immortalized in a feature film. Williams was in his workshop when the first explosion hit, the blast door blowing off its hinges and slamming into him. Dazed and wounded, he navigated the burning, debris-strewn maze of the rig, his path lit only by the fires, and made his way to the bridge. There, he joined a small, heroic band of officers and crew members who were making a last, desperate attempt to save the rig and to account for their missing crewmates. The order to abandon ship was given. The crew began to make their way to the lifeboat stations, but the fire was spreading with terrifying speed, cutting off their escape routes. One of the primary lifeboat stations was engulfed in flames. The crew was forced to make their way to the secondary station, a frantic, smoke-filled journey through a landscape of melting steel and falling debris. They managed to launch one of the massive, covered lifeboats, but it was not large enough for everyone. Dozens of crew members were left stranded on the burning rig, their escape to the sea blocked by a wall of fire. They were trapped, 100 feet above the dark, churning waters of the Gulf. With the inferno closing in around them, their only option was a terrifying one: to jump from a height equivalent to a 10-story building into a dark, debris-filled ocean that was now itself on fire, with pools of ignited crude oil burning on the surface. For many, the choice was between the certainty of being burned alive and the terrifying uncertainty of the leap. One by one and in small, desperate groups, they jumped. Mike Williams, who was one of the last to leave the rig, made the terrifying leap, landing in the water and swimming through the smoke and the flames toward the distant, bobbing lights of the lifeboats. A massive search and rescue operation was launched almost immediately. The first to arrive on the scene was the Damon B. Bankston, the offshore supply vessel that serviced the Deepwater Horizon. Its crew watched in horror as the rig they had just left a few hours earlier was consumed by fire. They began the desperate work of pulling the survivors from the water, their searchlights cutting through the smoke, their own vessel threatened by the intense heat of the inferno. The Coast Guard dispatched helicopters and cutters to the scene, and a fleet of nearby vessels all converged on the burning rig, a spontaneous maritime army of rescuers. By the early morning hours, the scale of the human tragedy was becoming clear. Of the 126 people who had been on board, 115 had been rescued, many with severe burns and other life-threatening injuries, but 11 men were still missing. They were the men who had been working on or near the drill floor, the area that had been at the very heart of the initial explosion. They were Dale Burkeen, Donald Clark, Stephen Ray Curtis, Gordon Jones, Roy Wyatt Kemp, Carl Kleppinger Jr., Keith Blair Manuel, Dewey Rivette, Shane Roshto, Adam Weiss, and Jason Anderson. A frantic, days-long search for them would be conducted, but they were never found. They were presumed to have been killed in the initial blast, their bodies consumed by the fire that had engulfed their workplace. They were fathers, husbands, and sons, the first and most tragic human cost of the disaster. For 2 days, the Deepwater Horizon burned with a furious, uncontrollable intensity, a massive, black pillar of smoke rising into the sky, visible for miles. The efforts to extinguish the fire were futile. The rig was a lost cause. On the morning of April 22, 2010, the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, the crippled, burned-out hulk of the Deepwater Horizon, one of the most advanced and expensive drilling rigs in the world, finally succumbed to its injuries. It tilted, groaned, and then sank beneath the waves of the Gulf of Mexico, disappearing into the 5,000-foot deep water below. The fire was out. The human tragedy of the explosion and the sinking was, for the most part, over. The world watched, horrified by the loss of life, but with a sense that the worst was now behind them. But the true disaster, the environmental catastrophe that would dwarf the initial explosion, was just beginning. The well at the bottom of the ocean, the wild, high-pressure Macondo well, was not sealed. The blowout preventer had failed, and from the broken, twisted end of the riser pipe, on the seafloor, a mile below the surface, a torrent of thick, black, crude oil was now gushing, unchecked, into the pristine waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon was gone, but the well from hell was now wide open. With the sinking of the Deepwater Horizon rig, the disaster entered a new, and in many ways a more insidious phase. The immediate, fiery, and very public human tragedy of the explosion was replaced by a silent, invisible, and far more protracted environmental catastrophe that was unfolding a mile beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. For the first few days, the American public and even the U.S. government was largely unaware of the true scale of the problem. BP, the company responsible for the well, initially and infamously claimed that the amount of oil leaking from the broken wellhead was relatively small, perhaps 1,000 barrels a day, and that the blowout preventer on the seafloor should have sealed the well automatically. But the reality, as it was slowly and painfully revealed, was far, far worse. The blowout preventer, the failsafe of last resort, had been damaged in the initial explosion and had failed to engage. The Macondo well was not leaking. It was hemorrhaging. A live underwater video feed from a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, which was eventually released to the public, showed a horrifying, mesmerizing image. A thick, black, relentless plume of crude oil and natural gas gushing from the broken end of the riser pipe. A wound in the earth that was bleeding directly into the heart of the ocean. The effort to stop the leak became a desperate, high-stakes, and deeply improvisational feat of engineering. A battle fought in a dark, high-pressure environment that was as alien and as unforgiving as the surface of the moon. For the next 87 days, the world watched, captivated and horrified, as BP and a team of the world's best engineers attempted a series of increasingly desperate and often futuristic-sounding solutions, all of which were broadcast live, turning the disaster into the world's first real-time, deep-sea reality show. Their first attempt was to use the ROVs, the small, unmanned submarines, to try and manually activate the blowout preventer. But the valves were too damaged. The attempt failed. Next, they tried to place a massive 125-ton containment dome, a 4-story high concrete and steel box, over the main leak. The plan was to funnel the gushing oil up to a ship on the surface. But in the extreme cold and high pressure of the deep sea, a slushy, ice-like formation of methane hydrates, a kind of underwater natural gas ice, quickly clogged the dome, making it buoyant and uncontrollable. The massive box was floated away, another failed multi-million-dollar solution. They then attempted a top kill, a procedure that involved pumping heavy drilling mud at high pressure down into the wellbore, in a direct, brute force attempt to overwhelm the upward pressure of the gushing oil and gas and to choke the well from the top down. For days, the world watched the live feed, a silent, abstract drama of mud and oil as BP engineers, and even the U.S. Secretary of Energy, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, expressed a cautious optimism. But the pressure from the Macondo reservoir was simply too great. The top kill failed. While these desperate, high-tech battles were being fought a mile below the surface, a slow, creeping, and devastating environmental disaster was unfolding on the surface of the Gulf. The oil, which was gushing out at a rate that was later estimated to be more than 60,000 barrels, or 2.5 million gallons, a day, began to spread. It formed a massive iridescent slick, a toxic blanket of oil that grew to be larger than the state of Oklahoma. To combat the surface slick, BP launched the largest and most controversial oil spill response in history. They deployed a massive fleet of skimming boats and thousands of miles of containment booms. But the most significant part of their response was the unprecedented use of a chemical dispersant called Corexits. Nearly 2 million gallons of this chemical, which acts like a detergent, breaking the oil down into smaller droplets, were sprayed on the surface and, for the first time ever, injected directly at the wellhead a mile below. The use of Corexits was a devil's bargain. It was effective at keeping the most visible part of the spill, the thick, black surface slick, away from the television cameras and the sensitive coastal marshes. But it did not make the oil disappear. Instead, it broke the oil down into tiny, toxic droplets that then became suspended in the water column, creating vast, submerged plumes of oil that were, in many ways, even more toxic and more insidious than the surface slick. The long-term environmental and human health consequences of introducing millions of gallons of this chemical cocktail into the Gulf ecosystem were, and remain, largely unknown. By June, the oil began to wash ashore. The pristine, white sand beaches and the fragile, vital coastal wetlands of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida were inundated with a thick, black, and toxic tide. The images were heartbreaking. Pelicans, their feathers matted with thick, brown sludge, unable to fly. Dolphins washing up dead on the shore. Ancient sea turtles struggling to breathe in the oily sheen. The Gulf's multi-billion-dollar fishing and tourism industries, the lifeblood of the coastal communities, were completely shut down. The environmental devastation was absolute, a wound on one of the most productive and delicate marine ecosystems on the planet. The economic and human toll on the Gulf Coast was just as profound. The fishermen, the oystermen, the shrimpers, the charter boat captains, the restaurant owners, the hotel workers. Their lives were thrown into a state of chaos and uncertainty. They were not just facing an environmental crisis. They were facing the complete and total destruction of their way of life, a way of life that had been passed down through generations. And they were now forced to deal with the frustrating, often insulting and bureaucratic process of filing claims with BP, a process that was, for many, a second kind of disaster. The anger, the fear, and the profound sense of loss in the coastal communities was a palpable, heartbreaking presence, a human tragedy that was unfolding in slow motion, day after agonizing day, while the environmental and economic catastrophe was unfolding across the Gulf Coast. The technical battle to kill the Macondo well continued, out of sight, a mile below the surface. After the failure of the top kill, BP and the government's engineers finally settled on a long-term and more reliable solution. They would drill 2 relief wells, a painstaking, months-long process of drilling new wells that would intersect the original Macondo wellbore deep beneath the seafloor. Once the intersection was made, they would be able to pump heavy mud and cement directly into the bottom of the well, permanently sealing it from below. In the meantime, they needed a temporary solution to capture the gushing oil. They finally achieved a partial success by installing a containment cap, a smaller, more tightly sealed version of the failed containment dome, over the broken riser pipe. This device, known as a top hat, was able to funnel a significant portion of the leaking oil up to ships on the surface. But it was not a perfect seal, and millions of gallons of oil continued to spew into the Gulf. Finally, on July 15, 2010, 87 days after the explosion, a new, more tightly fitting capping stack was installed. For the first time since April 20th, the flow of oil into the Gulf of Mexico was stopped. A tense, watchful silence descended over the live video feed from the seafloor. The well was capped, but it was not yet dead. The final, permanent kill was achieved in September, when the first of the relief wells successfully intercepted the Macondo wellbore and heavy mud and cement were pumped in, permanently sealing the reservoir. The longest and largest accidental marine oil spill in history was finally over. The final accounting of the disaster was staggering. The U.S. government estimated that a total of 4.9 million barrels, or more than 200 million gallons of crude oil had gushed into the Gulf of Mexico. The environmental damage was generational. The spill had decimated marine life, destroyed coastal habitats, and left a toxic legacy in the deep-sea ecosystem that scientists are still struggling to understand. The economic toll on the Gulf Coast was in the tens of billions of dollars. The legal and financial fallout for the companies involved was monumental. A series of government investigations and presidential commissions were launched, and their findings were a damning indictment of a corporate culture that had repeatedly and systematically prioritized profits over safety. The investigations revealed a long chain of flawed decisions made by BP, Transocean, and the cementing contractor, Halliburton, in the hours and days leading up to the blowout. From the use of a cheaper, less stable well design, to the decision to skip critical safety tests, to the final fatal misinterpretation of the negative pressure test, the disaster was shown to be not an unforeseeable act of God, but the direct, predictable result of a cascade of human error, corporate greed, and a shocking level of managerial incompetence. BP, as the primary owner and operator of the well, bore the brunt of the financial and legal consequences. The company was forced to establish a $20 billion compensation fund for the victims of the spill. They would go on to pay more than $65 billion in total costs, including cleanup expenses, civil penalties, and criminal fines. In 2012, BP pleaded guilty to 11 felony counts of manslaughter for the deaths of the 11 crewmen, as well as a host of other environmental and financial crimes. It was one of the largest corporate criminal resolutions in U.S. history. Several high-level BP and Transocean employees were also indicted, though most were later acquitted or had their charges dropped. The legacy of the Deepwater Horizon disaster is a profound and deeply cautionary one. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the immense risks and the catastrophic potential consequences of our global dependence on fossil fuels. It exposed the deep systemic flaws in the regulatory oversight of the offshore drilling industry, an industry that had become, in the years leading up to the disaster, dangerously cozy with the very government agencies that were supposed to be policing it. In the aftermath of the spill, a major overhaul of offshore drilling safety regulations was implemented, and a new, more independent federal agency was created to oversee the industry. But the most powerful legacy of the disaster is a human one. It is the story of the 11 men who lost their lives in the initial explosion, and of the families they left behind. It is the story of the thousands of Gulf Coast residents whose livelihoods and way of life were destroyed by the black tide that washed up on their shores. And it is a story of a profound and lasting breach of trust, a story of a powerful multinational corporation that, in its relentless pursuit of profit, gambled with the lives of its workers and the health of an entire ecosystem, and lost. Today, the oil is mostly gone from the surface of the Gulf and from its white sand beaches. The fishing boats are back on the water, and the tourists have returned. But for the people who live and work on the Gulf Coast, and for the scientists who study the deep, hidden life of the ocean, the memory of the Black Spring of 2010 is a permanent, sorrowful presence. The Deepwater Horizon is a ghost, a monument of twisted steel lying a mile below the surface, a permanent, silent reminder of the terrible, and often hidden, price of our modern world's insatiable thirst for oil.